Chapter 547. Let's talk about the future in the future. Eric shook his head and smiled, but he wasn't too worried about this problem. The fundamental problem with MGM was still in its business philosophy. Until now, MGM still maintained the vertical business philosophy passed down from the era of big studios. But since the 1980s, several other major Hollywood film companies had begun to try to diversify their development. They worked hard to open up surrounding industrial chains related to movies, such as audio and video, books, records, toys, theme parks, and so on, maximizing the locomotive effect of the movie business. Through the development of profit channels, it increased the film company's ability to resist risks. But at the same time, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer fell into the hands of the casino tycoon, Kirk Kerkorian, who preferred to play with capital operations. The casino tycoon was obviously more interested in transforming Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer into a hotel than making a movie. As a result, the veteran movie giant missed the best opportunity to transform. And now, the Hollywood film companies that had opened up the industrial chain began a new trend of integration with the media groups. Once this trend was completed, MGM would be completely left behind, and there would be no chance for it to catch up with the pace of its peers who were integrated with the media groups. In this case, Eric providing some high-quality film projects for MGM would only make the film company prosperous for a while. In the future, when everyone was busy dividing the profits, MGM would still be the declining MGM. After saying goodbye to Chris, Eric went back to his room to change his clothes. He then took a car to a restaurant in New York on the banks of the Seine. He was going to meet a vice president named Marcel Noir in the investment department of Credit Lyonnais Bank, and the current president of MGM Pictures, John Kerry. In 1990, Kirk Kerkorian sold MGM to an Italian investor, Giancarlo Parenti, for $1.3 billion. However, not long after, the U.S. Federal Securities and Exchange Commission discovered that there was a major problem with the transaction. The Italian investor, Giancarlo Parenti's company, was just an empty shell. The whole transaction process was completely a fraud to acquire MGM. Giancarlo Parenti was eventually jailed for this fraud, but Credit Lyonnais was the biggest victim, because Credit Lyonnais Bank was the financier of the transaction. At the end of last year, the fraud case was finally decided, and Giancarlo got the punishment he deserved. But the transaction was still declared valid. The 75% shares of MGM that Giancarlo Parenti got from Corkery were transferred to Credit Lyonnais Bank. In order to get rid of MGM, Credit Lyonnais Bank organized an auction, but no one dared to take over the mess. Credit Lyonnais Bank could only reorganize the management of MGM and poach Frank Marcheso and John Kerry to form a new management team, hoping to improve MGM's performance and find a successor smoothly. But now the two new helmers got off to a bad start. The two movies, Bear Peak and Last Action Hero, released in the summer season with a lot of money, both ended in failure. Along the way, Eric was thinking about the plan to match the cooperation between the European Film Company and MGM. After the hotel car stopped, Eric saw two white men greeting him warmly as soon as he got out of the car. Eric recognized John Kerry, who was about 60 years old and had gray hair, at a glance. Eric had seen him at some events in Los Angeles before, but until the celebration party of Fragrant, the two had no interaction. John Kerry was originally a senior executive in the production department of Warner Pictures. He had been working in Warner Pictures since the end of the 60s, and was an old man from the era of Steve Ross. After Steve Ross's death, the two co-presidents of Warner Pictures gradually intensified their internal strife for the position of CEO. Coupled with the invitation from Credit Lyonnais Bank, John Kerry left his old employer, where he had worked for many years, to become the president of MGM Pictures. Eric blamed the unlucky CEO of Carlock Pictures for the hype of Bear Peak and Jurassic Park, so he didn't know that it was actually the two helmers of MGM who created this mess. However, even if he knew, Eric wouldn't care too much now. Anyway, the two movies from MGM had now ended in failure, and it didn't have any impact on Jurassic Park. Seeing John Kerry greeting him warmly with another Frenchman in his 40s or 50s with a big nose, Eric also walked up quickly with a smile. "Eric, I'm glad you could come tonight." John Kerry hugged Eric and then introduced, This is Mr. Marcel Noir from Credit Lyonnais Bank. Hello, Mr. Noir. Eric reached out to the other party. Marcel Noir and Eric chatted for a while before the three walked into the restaurant. The waiter led the three to a quiet corner. After ordering, Marcel Noir couldn't wait to get straight to the point. Although Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer ranked last among the 7 major Hollywood studios, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's scale could be said to be the largest in Europe. What surprised Eric, but also felt reasonable, was that Credit Lyonnais Bank actually hoped that Firefly could take over MGM. After Marcel Noir made this suggestion, he noticed Eric's slightly surprised look and continued. Eric, as long as you agree to take over MGM, Credit Lyonnais is willing to give a very reasonable price. Moreover, we will also be responsible for lobbying the U.S. Federal Securities and Exchange Commission to pass this transaction request. Firefly Pictures had now reached a peak in Hollywood. If it continued to expand in the film business, it would definitely involve the issue of monopoly. It could be imagined that if Firefly Pictures merged with other major Hollywood studios again, it would definitely receive pressure from all sides. However, Eric was very clear that among the film companies other than Firefly Pictures, other goals were difficult to achieve at the moment. However, if he launched the acquisition of MGM, the resistance would be much less. There would even be people secretly facilitating this. The ruling of the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission was also greatly influenced by capital forces. If Firefly acquired MGM at this time, it was equivalent to taking a big burden into their arms. This big burden would definitely drag down the pace of Firefly's expansion and affect the evaluation of Firefly Pictures by investment institutions. If it were other times, in the face of MGM's rich film library resources, Eric would not mind taking over MGM and slowly adjusting it. However, in the next few years, Firefly would not stop accelerating the pace of expansion. At this time, it was absolutely impossible to take over the mess of MGM. Since Marcel Noir was so direct, Eric did not beat around the bush. He bluntly refused. Marcel, I'm really sorry. I can't agree to your request, because I can't think of any reason to take over MGM now. Of course, Credit Lyonnais could not have guessed Eric's strong interest in MGM's film library. Therefore, Eric's reaction was not unexpected by Marcel Noir. He originally did not have much hope that Eric would agree to this matter. He proposed this proposal to Eric out of desperation. Credit Lyonnais was one of the 3 major banks in France. Not only did it operate traditional banking business, but it also involved investment banking and insurance. Because of the European economic recession caused by the turmoil in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in the early 1990s, Credit Lyonnais fell into huge losses for several years in a row. The amount of losses this year was expected to be as high as 11 billion francs, equivalent to $2 billion US. The MGM that was affected by the fraud case accounted for a large part of the losses. Credit Lyonnais was now eager to cash out this hot potato. Because he did not have much hope in his heart, after hearing Eric's refusal, Marcel Noir did not continue to pester him. When the waiter in the restaurant served the dishes one after another, Marcel Noir gently winked at John Kerry. John Kerry nodded slightly, put down his knife and fork, and turned to Eric. Eric, I don't know if you are interested in the 007 series? Eric smiled slightly, thinking that it was indeed the case. However, speaking of which, MGM really did not have any bargaining chips to cooperate with him. The only thing Credit Lyonnais wanted to do now was to sell MGM. It did not want to invest in Firefly's film business like other European film companies. The 007 series was like a life-saving ginseng for MGM. Every time they were terminally ill, they would cut off a piece, and then they could live on for a few years. Before the 16th 007, whether it was during the United Artists or MGM era, the production cycle of 007 was 2 years. The reason why this long-lasting series was suddenly stopped 4 years ago, in addition to MGM's continuous turmoil and copyright disputes, was mainly because the 16th 007 License to Kill was too bad in box office and reputation. The budget of License to Kill was $32 million at that time, but it only earned more than $33 million at the box office in the United States. If it were not for the global recovery of the loss, Made of Murder almost became the first loss-making sequel of the 007 series. For a classic legendary agent series, the loss of one investment was of course nothing, but MGM was more afraid that the reputation of the series would be completely destroyed. If the 17th or even the 18th movie still could not be recognized by the fans, then the series was likely to be completely stopped. Therefore, MGM hesitated for several years in the process of starting the production of the 17th 007 movie, and until now there was no result. Speaking of The Last License to Kill, although the reputation of this sequel is very bad, I think one of the settings is very interesting, Eric replied. He could not help but think of Kelly Lowe, who played Sam's deceased wife in Sleepless in Seattle. Kelly Lowe was the Bond girl in License to Kill. Eric and Kelly Lowe had a night of fun in Seattle, but the girl left after that night, and Eric never saw her again. When John Carrier heard Eric's words, he asked naturally, "What setting?" "The setting of two Bond girls." License to Kill is the only 007 movie where two Bond girls are jealous of Bond, and even shed tears because of it. Unfortunately, the plot conceived by the screenwriter of the last movie was more focused on a revenge movie, but it lost the essence of a Bond movie, so it did not highlight the two Bond girls. Moreover, I also think that there is something wrong with the setting of two Bond girls. John Carrier hesitated, but still chose the first key point in Eric's words and asked, "Eric, what do you think is the essence of the 007 movie?" Eric smiled mischievously and said, "Of course it is to save the world." John Carrier and Marcel Noir, who was on the other side, were stunned for a moment before laughing along with Eric. But after laughing, John Carrier realized that although Eric's words were a little teasing, they hit the core of the 007 series, so he immediately asked, "What do you mean by the setting of two Bond girls?" Eric was also interested. He put down the cutlery and said, "In the traditional production idea, the Bond girls have always been Bond's assistant or lover. Even if there are two Bond girls in the 16th movie, it still can't escape this mindset. But why don't we do the opposite and set two Bond girls, one good and one evil? One is Bond's assistant, and the other is Bond's enemy." Just like Warner's two recent Batman movies, although Batman's actor, Michael Keaton, was quite popular, the villains in both the first and second movies attracted more attention from the audience. Needless to say, Jack Nicholson's Joker will definitely be a classic imitated by later generations, and Michelle Pfeiffer and Danny DeVito's Catwoman and Penguin also left a deep impression on the audience. This shows that after watching so many righteous protagonists in the movies, the audience is still very much looking forward to the villains with distinctive characters. This is a big breakthrough for the 007 series. When Marcel Noir heard Eric's words, he subconsciously felt that it made sense, but he didn't have a deep feeling about it. However, John Carrier, who had been in the production industry for more than 20 years, had a glint in his eyes. As a former executive of Warner Brothers' production department, John Carrier had also experienced the joy of the success of the first Batman series. But internally, Warner Brothers only attributed the success of the Batman series to the popularity accumulated over decades of comic serialization. They didn't think too deeply about it. Eric's casual words at this time made John Carrier feel suddenly enlightened. Perhaps Warner Brothers' more than $50 million share for Jack Nicholson's Joker role was not too unjust. At the same time, John Carrier could not help admiring Eric's keen thinking and vision. It was not unreasonable for this young man to achieve such dazzling success at such a young age. Although John Carrier sighed in his heart, he did not forget to strike while the iron was hot. "Eric, since you have such an idea, why not just be the director of the 17th 007 movie? MGM will definitely give you a satisfactory offer." Eric picked up the red wine beside him and took a sip. However, he did not directly answer John Carrier's invitation. Instead, he said, "John, is MGM willing to maintain a strong interest in the 007 series?" John Carrier's heart skipped a beat, but he did not show it on his face. He sighed softly and said, "Eric, you know we don't have much choice. There is a very good opportunity right now." Eric put down the wine glass and looked at Marcel Noir. "However, this needs credit lyonnaise to pull the strings." Although Marcel Noir did not know much about movies, He was sensitive enough to realize that Eric's next words would definitely have a great impact on MGM's current situation. Eric, if Credit Lyonnais can help, we will definitely do our best. Tell us your thoughts. Eric said, recently several film companies and film foundations want to invest in Hollywood. However, Firefly's production plan for the next 2 years has been more than half confirmed. It will be very inconvenient to adjust it, and it will not maximize the profits. Therefore, I think maybe we can cooperate. I will be responsible for selecting the appropriate projects and participating in the production as appropriate. The European film companies and film foundations will be responsible for the investment, and MGM will be responsible for the production and distribution. This will not only solve MGM's current operational difficulties, but also make full use of the European financial advantage. Marcel Noir kept nodding throughout the whole process. After listening carefully to Eric, he turned to look at John Kerry. John Kerry's eyes were also filled with interest. However, compared to Marcel Noir, John Kerry was more aware of the difficulty of implementing Eric's proposal. Although Eric's personal contribution seemed to be the least in this cooperation proposal, in fact his personal participation was the most valuable part. Just like in the original Spacetime, because of Steven Spielberg's strong appeal, DreamWorks had just announced its establishment, and investors from all over the world rushed to provide more than $1 billion of startup capital. At this time, if it were not for Eric, perhaps those European film companies would not even consider cooperating with MGM. After all, the 2 blockbusters released during the summer had already made them afraid. However, at the same time, the European film companies were the clearest about MGM's current situation. Even with Eric taking the lead, the possibility of them agreeing was still very slim. Eric, personally, I am very much looking forward to this cooperation, but... John Kerry was just about to continue speaking when he noticed Marcel Noir's wink, so he stopped speaking. After all, he was only a professional manager at MGM. Seeing that Marcel Noir seemed to be very enthusiastic about this proposal, John Kerry could not immediately pour cold water on him. He could only change his tone and said, "But we still have to negotiate with all parties." Marcel Noir immediately interjected, "Eric, we will give you an answer as soon as possible. In addition, Credit Lyonnais will do its best to facilitate this matter." "Then I'll wait for your good news," Eric nodded. The following conversation was much more relaxed. John Kerry continued to ask Eric about his opinions on the movie villains. Eric was not stingy and shared some of the theories he had seen in his previous life with John Kerry. It was not until 9:30 that the 3 of them ended the dinner. After paying the bill, John Kerry and Marcel Noir walked Eric out of the restaurant. After leaving the restaurant, Eric stood by the roadside and said goodbye to the 2. Then he saw a beautiful figure walking out of the bright restaurant hall. It was Sophie Marceau, whom he had not seen for a few days. At this time, the girl was accompanied by a tall middle-aged man in his 40s. He looked like a typical French. The middle-aged man chattered endlessly as he walked out with Sophie. John Kerry and Marcel Noir followed Eric's gaze almost at the same time. John Kerry had also attended the fragrance celebration party at the Sedoua's house that night, so he knew some inside information. He winked at Marcel Noir, and John Kerry said to Eric, "Eric, in that case, we'll take our leave first." Eric did not mind John Kerry and Marcel Noir's teasing and flirting at the same time. After saying goodbye, he took the initiative to walk toward Sophie. When he came close to the 2, although Eric did not understand French, he could clearly recognize Sophie's impatient expression. After adapting to the dim light outside, Sophie saw Eric at a glance. The girl's expression was a little surprised at first. Then she winked mischievously at Eric and pouted at the middle-aged man beside her. Obviously, she was hinting for Eric to help her out. The middle-aged man noticed the change in Sophie's expression and looked forward. Only then did he see a young man in his 20s walking toward him. The young man was wearing a decent black suit. His face was chiseled, and his temperament was calm and steady. He also gave off a faint sense of oppression that was difficult to ignore. Although he felt that the young man's appearance was somewhat familiar, the middle-aged man could not recognize Eric's identity for a moment. However, he instinctively felt a trace of vigilance. When he saw Eric coming in front of the two of them, the middle-aged man took a slight step forward and reached out to Eric. He said in French, "Hello, my name is Frederick Blonde. May I know who you are?" To the middle-aged man's surprise, the young man in front of him had a look of confusion in his eyes. He looked at the middle-aged man's outstretched hand, but had no intention of responding. He just turned his gaze to Sophie. Sophie knew that Eric did not understand much French, so she smiled mischievously. However, she still had to test Eric to help her out. Sophie could only quickly say to the middle-aged man, "He doesn't understand French. You can use English." When Frederick Blonde heard Sophie's words, a trace of contempt flashed in his eyes. However, he still used English to introduce himself again. Eric then reached out to shake his hand. "Hello, I'm Eric Williams." Frederick Blonde immediately remembered Eric's identity after he said his name. They were both in the film industry. Of course, it was impossible for him not to know Eric, the young Hollywood mogul who had created the miracle of Firefly Pictures in just a few years. Thinking of this, Frederick Blonde immediately put away the trace of contempt that had just appeared and said eagerly, "Mr. Williams, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm a producer at TF1 Film Studio." "Oh, TF1, I know." Eric nodded. He was just about to blurt out names such as Paddington Bear, Air Rescue, Supernatural, but he immediately realized that these were movies more than 10 years in the future. His mind froze and he felt a little embarrassed. He looked at Sophie and said, "That's Sophie's Heartbeat, is from your company, right?" Sophie noticed that Eric was a little embarrassed and laughed. Frederick Blonde did not dare to be as unscrupulous as Sophie. He nodded and said, "Yes, it was jointly invested by us in Gaumont." "Oh." Eric nodded and did not intend to continue the conversation. He pointed to Sophie, who was still grinning without caring about her image, and said, "Sophie and I haven't seen each other for a long time. Do you mind if we talk alone?" "What do you mean by long time? Do I know you that well?" The girl thought to herself. She rolled her eyes at Eric but did not deny it. "Of course. In that case, I'll take my leave first." Frederick Blonde said a few more words to Sophie, said goodbye, and walked towards the parking lot. "Phew, luckily I met you. Otherwise, I wouldn't know how to get rid of this annoying guy." Sophie waited until the middle-aged man's figure disappeared into a white BMW before she said in relief. Eric gestured to the hotel driver not far away and pointed to the Seine River on the other side of the road. "Let's take a walk there." "Ah, that okay." Sophie seemed to have realized something, but she did not reject Eric's invitation. She followed him across the road and came to the Seine River. The two walked down the steps all the way to the embankment of the Seine River. The night was dark, and there were many couples strolling on the embankment, but no one paid attention to the two of them. Looking at Sophie, who seemed to have shrunk her neck slightly because of the cold night, Eric asked, "Since you hate that guy, why did you have dinner with him?" "My agent just accepted a movie for me." Sophie seemed to have recalled the unpleasant experience just now and said angrily, "I suddenly received an invitation tonight to talk about the script." In the end, the director and screenwriter left early, leaving only that annoying guy who kept pestering me. If I had known, I wouldn't have come. I only accepted this script because of Alexander Dumas. Listening to Sophie's proud tone, Eric smiled gently and said, "Which one is Alexander Dumas' work?" Sophie said, "The sequel to The Three Musketeers. It's about D'Artagnan's daughter. If he keeps pestering me, I won't take it. It's not like I can't find a movie to shoot." Chapter 548. Eric thought to himself that it should be the movie Passion for the Rose, and said, "Since you're not happy, then you might as well not take it." "That's easy for you to say. I still have to make money to support my family. If I don't act if I'm not happy, then I can forget about acting in anything in the future," Sophie said to Eric in a teasing tone, as if she had forgotten what she had just said. Passing by a street lamp, Sophie stepped on her short shadow and jumped a few times briskly. Her high heels made a series of crisp clicks on the stone floor. The hem of her light blue dress fluttered in the light, occasionally revealing her fair and slender calves. Eric looked at Sophie's slightly childish movements with some affection. He thought to himself that the spirited girl in the first kiss had not grown up, but she had learned to compromise. He wondered if it was a pity. Sophie jumped a few times and naturally walked to Eric's right side. Eric looked at the soft and beautiful face beside him and said, "Why don't you come to Hollywood? I'll introduce you to a movie." Sophie looked at Eric. Only then did she remember that the young man beside her was the big boss of Firefly Films, who was in the limelight in Hollywood. He was also the director of a series of global hit movies. However, Sophie had never worked with a Hollywood director before. Looking at Eric's youthful face, she really could not feel a sense of awe for this young man's other identity like she did for Frederick Bloom of the TF1 company. The girl was stunned for a moment. Looking at the gentle smile on Eric's face, she suddenly relaxed and said with a smile, "Then tell me what movie it is first. I won't act if I'm not interested." Eric remembered the topic he had just discussed with John Kerry in the restaurant and said, "What about the Bond girl?" Sophie immediately said with a look of disdain, "That guy who goes around picking up girls, acting cool, and can save the world?" Eric laughed and said, "Yeah, that guy. Are you interested?" Sophie dragged her tone a little. "Not interested. Don't be so sure. Why don't you give it a try? You'll definitely become the most beautiful Bond girl in history. If I were to play it, I'd play the villain. I'd kill Bond and destroy the world," Sophie said, showing her white teeth fiercely. But her melancholy face, naturally artistic and melancholy, did not betray any fierceness. "All right, I'll let you be the villain. Kill Bond and destroy the world." Sophie turned sideways and stared at Eric's expression for a few seconds. Suddenly she asked in surprise, "Are you serious?" Eric nodded solemnly. "Of course, do I look like I'm joking?" "Forget it." Sophie's face suddenly turned red. Even under the dim street lights, it was very obvious. She threw out this sentence in a panic, and then glared fiercely at Eric. "You're a guy who likes to sweet-talk women. I'll never fall for your tricks again." "But I'm clearly discussing this matter with you very seriously," Eric said with an innocent look. "Before I met you, I happened to be discussing the 007 series with John Kerry, the president of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Pictures. MGM is likely to use the setting of two Bond girls in the latest 007 sequel. If you're interested, I can recommend you to play the villain." Sophie realized that Eric really wasn't joking. She remembered her oversensitive reaction just now and felt a little embarrassed. She unconsciously quickened her pace and walked towards the stairs leading away from the Seine River embankment. Eric looked at the girl's back as she ran away. He smiled and quickly followed her. After leaving the embankment, Eric saw Sophie standing on the side of the road waiting for a taxi. He stepped forward and gently pulled the girl. "How about I send you back? It's not easy to get a taxi right now." Sophie looked at Eric and saw that he was all alone. She smiled and said, "How are you going to send me back?" Eric smiled confidently and mysteriously. "I'll show you a magic trick." Eric raised his right hand and skillfully snapped his fingers. Sophie widened her eyes in anticipation and curiosity. Her beautiful eyes stared at Eric's raised right hand. Then still nothing happened. The crisp laughter of Schadenfreude soon spread out under the dim yellow street lights. "Ha ha, ha ha. Okay, Eric, it's late. I have to go home," Sophie said as she saw a taxi coming from afar. She was about to go up and wave when she was stopped again. Eric pointed at a black car coming from the other side. "Here, my car is." The black car stopped in front of them. The driver got out of the car and respectfully opened the door. Eric gently pushed Sophie. Sophie couldn't think of an excuse to refuse, so she got into the back seat. Eric got into the car from the other side and asked, "I still don't know where you live." Sophie rolled her eyes at Eric and deliberately spoke to the driver in French. She then proudly raised her chin at Eric. The black car continued to drive along New York Avenue for a while, then turned into a road in the northwest. It drove through the streets of Paris for more than 10 minutes before stopping in front of a typical 5-story European-style apartment. Sophie said goodbye to Eric and politely thanked the driver. She opened the door, jumped out, and ran toward the apartment. Eric said a few words to the driver, and also got out of the car. Sophie quickly entered the password on the door. She was about to open the heavy iron door when she was shocked by Eric's figure next to her. "You, what do you want?" Sophie instinctively panicked. Her two small hands subconsciously covered her body. Eric looked harmless. "Sophie, I'm thirsty," the woman burst out laughing. But she immediately pulled a long face and glared at Eric. "Eric, can you think of a worse excuse?" Eric pointed at the car that sped away. "There." Sophie looked at the black car that quickly disappeared around the corner. She seemed to have found a reasonable excuse in her heart. She opened the iron door of the apartment and let Eric in. She didn't forget to cover her ears. "You have to leave after drinking water." "No problem. Also, don't mess around." "I swear." "You don't sound sincere at all." "I swear to God." "Don't. What if God takes his anger out on me? I'll let him punish only me." Smooth talker. In the narrow corridor of the apartment, the two bickered in a low voice and soon disappeared around the corner. In just a week, Sophie woke up in the arms of a man she didn't know well. She couldn't help but repent for her fall. However, Sophie still didn't understand why she fell so easily when she was next to the man who was holding her at this time. She could only feel that she was very comfortable with Eric. He could always easily guess her thoughts. Even if there were occasional disagreements in their conversations, the disagreements were clear-cut. Moreover, Eric never tried to persuade her to agree with his point of view. He seemed to know from the beginning that she hated the kind of people who liked to preach. Although the two had known each other for less than a week, he seemed to have known her for many years. Sophie even remembered the words Eric said when he first appeared in front of her. "I think I should have known you in my previous life, so I came up to say hello." In an apartment in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, in a cool and sunny summer morning, Sophie suddenly felt that maybe what he said was true. Oh, how silly. Although she felt that her idea was ridiculous, Sophie still turned her body curiously, as if she wanted to take advantage of the fact that he was sound asleep to ask. But just as she turned over, she met Eric's bright eyes. You're awake?" Sophie said, pretending to be calm. Eric could feel Sophie's waist suddenly tighten slightly. Puzzled, he asked, "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Sophie shook her head gently and said, "You should go." Eric reached for the watch on the dressing table and looked at it. It wasn't even 8 o'clock yet. So he retreated back into the bed and hugged Sophie. He rubbed his chin on the woman's round shoulder and said, "It's still early. Sleep a little longer." Sophie opened her mouth and wanted to say something, but she gave up the idea. Since she didn't have any work to do today, she obediently leaned into Eric's arms. At the same time, she twisted her body and pulled Eric's arm to a more comfortable position. The two of them were like little mice snuggling together in the cold winter. After an unknown amount of time, they opened their eyes at the same time as if they had a tacit understanding. Eric sniffed and smelled the faint smell of toast. He said to Sophie, "Am I hallucinating because I'm hungry?" Sophie chuckled and said, "There's a bakery downstairs. I'm hungry too. Get up and buy some bread." Eric immediately bargained, "I don't speak French. You go." "You don't speak French, and you don't know how to use francs?" Eric buried his head in Sophie's fragrant pillow and continued to act shamelessly. "I'm a big shot. I never carry small change with me." Sophie pinched Eric, feeling both annoyed and amused at the same time. She crawled out of bed and walked to the wardrobe barefooted. She casually picked out a set of loose pink home clothes and put them on. She then took out a few notes from her wallet and walked out the door in her furry slippers. Eric watched the girl's figure disappear. He stretched comfortably and slowly got up to put on his clothes. Then, after a simple breakfast, Eric was kicked out by Sophie again. Strange. Why did she say again? Eric, of course, could empathize with Sophie's feelings. In his past life, Sophie had not worked with Zaraski in any movies for 10 years after she finished filming The Blue Movement in 1991. Now, The Blue Movement was a movie from 2 years ago. Although her relationship with Zaraski had started to fade, just like the movie, When Love Becomes a Habit, that Sophie had directed herself in her past life, the two of them had not officially separated. It had just become a habit. From some of Sophie's performances in his past life, Eric knew that Sophie had been drifting around Hollywood for many years. What Eric needed to do now was to bring Sophie to Hollywood 2 years before Braveheart was released. This was a simple task for him. From his conversation with Sophie, Eric could also feel that Sophie was not averse to an invitation from Hollywood. Or rather, an invitation from him. Back at the hotel, he met with Chris. After a brief discussion, Chris formally submitted an offer to Nokia's management in Finland to acquire Nokia's mobile communications division. Unsurprisingly, Nokia's management rejected Firefly's investment proposal immediately. Nokia's offer was to sell 20% of Nokia's shares in exchange for $250 million of development funds. This proposal was very different from Eric's expectations. However, Eric also knew that, just like Firefly's acquisition proposal, Nokia's proposal was also a test. As for the bottom line of both parties, it would take a long time for negotiations to be finalized. After the formal contact, Chris did not continue to stay in Paris. Instead, he led Firefly's acquisition team to Helsinki, the capital of Finland. Eric remained in Paris, but he kept in close contact with Chris. In addition, to Eric's surprise, the proposal he proposed on the night of his meeting with Marcel Noir of Credit Lyonnais and John Kerry of MGM was unanimously opposed by all the film forces in Europe. It was also very obvious that although Eric's proposal had good prospects, no one wanted to step into the mess that was MGM. Over the years, MGM didn't have any outstanding performance other than making a lot of money from Kirk Kerkorian's capital operations. On the other hand, Kirk Kerkorian had never invested a single cent in MGM. MGM's operating method was to continuously issue corporate bonds. They used this method to raise funds to produce and distribute movies. However, after more than a decade, there were not many blockbuster movies produced, and the accumulated debt grew higher and higher. After the box office failures of Bear Peak of the Mountain and Last Action Hero, which were released during the summer, not only could the largest shareholder, Credit Lyonnais, not only could it not obtain any benefits from MGM, but it also had to continue to invest in MGM to prevent MGM from falling into a debt crisis. Under such circumstances, it was not difficult to understand why these European film forces were unwilling to step into this mess. Eric had no choice but to consider for a while, and quickly came up with a plan that was easier to accept. Chapter 549. Set up a brand new production company. Everyone will jointly hold shares and invest in the production of the movie. Sign a long-term cooperative distribution agreement with MGM. This way, we can not only use MGM's distribution channels, but also avoid falling into MGM's debt trap and fully protect the interests of investors. Eric said to the representatives of several European film companies in the mansion of the Seydoux family in the western suburbs of Paris. This method was similar to the previous cooperation between Carlock Pictures and MGM. However, due to the box office failure of the two summer blockbusters, there was definitely no need for the two parties to continue to cooperate. Most people in the reception room neither shook their heads nor nodded after listening to Eric's suggestion. However, Marcel Noir, the representative of Credit Lyonnais, looked a little disappointed. However, Eric had already communicated with him before. These people were not willing to agree to the initial plan at all. Eric could not force these European film forces to join MGM. Nicolas Seydoux, the CEO of Gaumont, who was sitting on the left of Eric, asked first. Eric, so Firefly intends to participate in this company in a cooperative manner? Firefly will participate in the shareholding and provide the corresponding hardware support for the production of the movie, such as the studio, post-production and so on, Eric replied. In addition, I will personally select 10 movies as the production plan of this company for the next 3 years. As for the rights and interests that everyone has in this company, it will be settled through negotiation. After Eric finished speaking, 7 or 8 people sitting in the reception room immediately whispered to each other. Eric did not rush them. He picked up the coffee next to him and drank slowly. After a round of discussion, Marcel Noir said, Eric, can MGM have a cross-shareholding with this company? Eric glanced at the people around him and smiled. If everyone agrees, I have no opinion. Cross-shareholding would definitely increase the operating risk of this new production company, but Eric was not too worried. As long as the plan was carried out, MGM's operating situation would definitely be reversed in the next few years. After exchanging shares with MGM, The new production company could even share a part of MGM's distribution profits. Moreover, this cooperation method would be more convenient for Firefly to directly or indirectly annex MGM in the next few years. After this period of consideration, Eric became more and more envious of MGM's film library. Everyone was also very clear about the pros and cons hearing Eric's words. They did not express their opinions. Daniel Isengard, the representative of German Kong Standing Film, asked in strange English, "Eric, MGM's business philosophy is very backward. More importantly, the profitability of the peripheral development of movies is very weak. How do you plan to solve this?" Eric glanced at Marcel Noir and said, "Firefly is very happy to act as the agent for this part of the business." Noir, 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 noir. Noir, noir, noir. The ultimate goal of Credit Lyonnais was to revitalize MGM, and then try to cash out at a more appropriate price in the next few years. It had no long-term plans, so Marcel Noir easily made this decision on behalf of Credit Lyonnais. At this point, the matter was almost settled. Everyone present knew that Eric was determined not to let them directly invest in Firefly Pictures. If they insisted, Eric might not refuse, but whether they could get a good cooperation plan was not certain. As people in the film industry, they knew very well that Hollywood had 100 ways to make them lose money. Of course, after years of cooperation, these people could easily avoid most of the traps set by Hollywood. Of course, there were still some people who were not reconciled. Daniel Isengard, the representative of German Kong Standing Film, who had just spoken, said again, "Eric, you just said that you have a production plan of 10 movies in 3 years. Can you talk about the genre of these movies, or the investment scale? Also, do you have a suitable project in mind now?" Eric looked at the other party and suddenly remembered that he still had the copyright of a novella related to Kong Standing Film, and that was Resident Evil. In the original spacetime, the Resident Evil series was invested in by Constantine Pictures. Only a rich and powerful investor like Germany would produce 6 consecutive installments of the Resident Evil series, which was not very profitable. Even until Eric's rebirth, the series still hadn't ended. "I wrote a novella called Resident Evil a few years ago. If the new company is established, I can put the copyright of this novel into the production company." Jurassic Park, which was still running rampant in the global box office market, was a change from Eric's original novel. In less than 2 months after the film was released, the global box office had exceeded $600 million, and its momentum showed no signs of slowing down. Moreover, it had not been released in a country like Japan, which was a huge box office. In the next few months, Jurassic Park's global box office would exceed $1 billion without any suspense. Therefore, when they heard Eric's words, everyone present was shocked. But then they remembered the information about Resident Evil. After Jurassic Park was released, many people inquired about Eric's other 2 novels, The Matrix and Resident Evil. However, everyone was very clear that even if they were to be developed, these 2 novels would definitely be reserved for Firefly Pictures, and there was no way for outsiders to get involved. Resident Evil was a limited-rated zombie novel, and this type of novel's audience was very limited. Even a famous director like Eric could not change this situation. Moreover, after the zombie novel was adapted into a movie, it would definitely be rated R, and the movie's audience would still be very small. Although with the support of Eric's personal halo, the movie's profits would definitely not be a problem, but it would definitely not be comparable to Jurassic Park. "Eric, I think your other novella, The Matrix, is also good. Why don't you take out the adaptation rights for this novel?" Eric shook his head slightly and said with a smile, "The current special effects technology still does not meet my requirements, so for the next 2 years, I will not consider changing The Matrix for the time being." The special effects of last year's Tornado and this year's Jurassic Park could only be described as shocking. The special effects technology in the digital domain was definitely the best in the industry. Many people present vaguely knew the content of The Matrix, and with the current technology in the digital domain, the production was not too big of a problem. For these European film forces, especially the German Film Fund, who had nowhere to invest, money was not a problem at all. Carlock Pictures had invested $150 million in the two movies that flopped during the summer. At this time, if they were asked to invest $150 million in a movie adaptation of Eric's novel, not many people would shake their heads and refuse to invest $150 million in a movie adaptation. Therefore, when they heard Eric lying through his teeth, more than half of the people in the reception room could not help but roll their eyes. Eric also knew that these people were all smart people. If he did not offer some tangible benefits, these people would not easily give in. After thinking for a while, he said, "How about this? Firefly is preparing a movie internally. It's an adaptation of a TV series from the 1970s. I can take it out and put it in the production company." There was no lack of well-informed people in the room. Nicholas Saidu immediately probed, "Eric, is it Thunderbolt?" Eric nodded. As Firefly already planned to release several blockbusters during the summer next year, forcing Thunderbolt into the summer would not get enough publicity resources from Firefly. Therefore, Eric was not in a hurry to produce Thunderbolt. He planned to carefully craft it. If it really did not work, he would put it in the new year next year. Although this would correspondingly prolong the investment period, it would also give Thunderbolt enough publicity resources to achieve better box office results. At this time, if he took Thunderbolt out and put it in the new production company, then he could use MGM's resources to release the movie during the summer next year. As for Drew, there was no problem. The little girl had always been obedient to Eric. Seeing that everyone in the reception room had a satisfied look, the representative of Credit Lyonnais Bank, Marcel Noir, could not wait to say, "In that case, Eric, why don't we discuss the specific equity distribution plan of the new production company?" Before Eric could answer, Daniel Isengard of Standing Pictures immediately interrupted. "Eric, how much is the total investment of the 10 movies in your plan?" "I can't answer this question for the time being." Eric smiled and shook his head. "However, the budget of Thunderbolt is about $60 million. If everyone doesn't want to make a fuss, the investment of the remaining 9 movies will probably maintain the same investment scale." "How can $60 million be enough? How about an average of $80 million? Daniel Isengard waved his hand somewhat heroically. "An average of $80 million, let's make it $800 million for 10 movies. Our German side can be responsible for $400 million, so we'll take 50% of the shares. How about that?" After Daniel Isengard finished speaking, the representatives of several other German companies nodded in agreement. Eric sighed in his heart. The Germans at this time were as rich as the Japanese who bought the whole world. If Germany was given 50% of the shares, what about the French film? There was also a British film company. It was impossible to let them go back shirtless. Nicholas Saidu also shrugged in amusement. Since Eric had promised so many benefits, Firefly Pictures' share of the production company would definitely not be less than 30%. If they gave 50% to the Germans, only 20% would be left for the others. It was not even enough to fill the gaps between their teeth, not to mention that they planned to exchange some shares with MGM. "Daniel, it's definitely impossible to give you 50%. If it's just a matter of funds, although we don't have as much funds as you, we can still take out $800 million. $800 million was equivalent to swallowing the new production company. Nicholas, we have more companies here. It's only right for us to take more." Daniel Isengard found a seemingly reasonable reason. Nicholas Saidu immediately retorted, "This is not a matter of the number of companies. Who doesn't know that when you Germans invest in a Hollywood film, you usually register several companies?" Eric listened quietly. In the blink of an eye, the reception room had turned into a wet market. He was not worried about the distribution of profits at all. If Firefly did not participate, this plan would not be implemented at all. Therefore, Eric was the most secure person in the fishing boat. The crowd was noisy for nearly 10 minutes before it finally quieted down. Eric said, "As for the specific cooperation plan, we can sit down and discuss it slowly. Of course, we can't drag this out for too long. Otherwise, it won't be good for anyone." As for Firefly, in addition to the 2 copyright resources of Resident Evil and Break-In, I will participate in the production of 10 films. Firefly only wants 30% of the company's shares. At the same time, they will share 30% of the gross profit of the production company after deducting the production costs. As for the development of the surrounding copyrights of the relevant films, according to normal business rules, Firefly will send someone to contact MGM Pictures. Eric did not mention any capital injection, but everyone in the reception room was very satisfied when they heard about the 30% gross profit share. After all, Eric was very generous to let them deduct the production costs. This greatly reduced the investment risk of everyone present. Moreover, Eric would definitely be very concerned about the production company's affairs. This was because this share would only be available if the film was profitable. If the company's film was a loss, Firefly would not get a single cent. Seeing that no one raised any objections, Eric continued. As for how to distribute the remaining 70% of the company's shares, as well as the cross-shareholding with MGM Pictures, it's up to you to discuss among yourselves. Just as everyone was about to nod in agreement, Eric said again, "Oh right, it's best to negotiate within a month. I hope that after the negotiation, we can start the production of Break-In as soon as possible. This way, we can also arrange for the release of the film during next year's summer." Eric, how should we distribute the cross-shareholding between the production company and MGM? Marcel Noiret asked at this time. Although their main objectives were different, Marcel Noiret knew that Credit Lyonnais should not give up the opportunity to participate in the production company. Eric thought for a while and said, "According to what we just said, the production company's valuation is $800 million. MGM's market value will be $1.2 billion. After everyone here has divided the shares of the new production company, the remaining shares will be exchanged with MGM according to the ratio." Chapter 550. After Eric stated the terms of the exchange, Marcel Vaurino was immediately unwilling. Even if only taking into account the 75% of MGM's shares held by Credit Lyonnais, he felt that $1.2 billion was an understatement. The overall valuation of MGM was only $1.2 billion, and the production company that no one had mentioned was directly offered $800 million by Eric. Eric, this condition is too harsh. Even if the overall market value of MGM is barely $1.2 billion, the production company is definitely not worth $800 million. Eric had no intention of refuting Marcel Vaurino. He smiled at the Frenchman and nodded. "Of course, if you don't agree, we can talk about it." Marcel Vaurino was stunned. He noticed the gazes of the other people in the reception room, and couldn't help but smile bitterly. He realized that at this point, since Eric had already spoken, MGM had no room to bargain. From the current situation, MGM was completely in a passive position. With Eric's plan for the production company, the other major film companies in Hollywood would definitely be very willing to take on the distribution work. The reason why MGM could get this opportunity was mainly because of Eric's personal will. If he didn't want to pay attention to MGM, he only needed to assist MGM in the production of the 007 series, to get rid of the hidden deal brought by the GATT. There was no need to do so much. Thinking of this, Marcel Vaurino nodded helplessly. "Okay, Eric, I will submit this plan to the board of directors as soon as possible." The matter was basically finalized. As the host, Nicolas Saidu was about to ask everyone to go to the dining room for dinner, when he suddenly thought of a question. "Eric, what do you want the production company to be called?" Eric didn't even think about it and said lazily, "Let's call it DreamWorks." DreamWorks, a good name. Yes, DreamWorks, a very good meaning. Everyone nodded in agreement, but Eric smiled mischievously. However, the new production company was indeed very similar to DreamWorks in the original space-time, so the name was very appropriate. However, if Spielberg wanted to do something big again, he would definitely have to choose another name for the film company. After dinner at the Saidu family mansion, Eric took a car back to the hotel. It was already 10:30 p.m., and it was still working hours in Los Angeles. Eric called the Firefly headquarters in Los Angeles and communicated with the management of Firefly Pictures. He also asked Michael Lynn to send a senior Firefly executive to participate in the negotiations for the new production company. A few days later, a vice president of Firefly Pictures rushed to Paris to be in charge of the negotiations between Firefly Pictures and DreamWorks Studios. The last stop of the European promotion, Madrid, had also completed its premiere. At the same time, the box office data of Jurassic Park in Paris was released quickly. Jurassic Park earned more than 27 million francs in the first week in France, while Germinal, which competed with Jurassic Park, only earned more than 6 million francs in the first week. Although the production cost of Germinal was only half of that of Jurassic Park, the production cost of more than 160 million francs was still the highest in French film history. After the data was released, the French media was in an uproar again, and they all asked the French government to pay attention to local films. However, Eric knew very well that a lot of things had already been settled in secret. At this time, it was already the final stage of the GATT negotiations. In the face of the insistence of some European countries, the United States government once again issued an ultimatum. If the GATT negotiations were not concluded before December 15, 1993, the entire agreement would be null and void. The European countries knew very well that if the agreement was really null and void, international trade would fall into a long period of chaos. This was something that Europe, which was in the midst of economic recovery, could not afford to do. When he received the news, Eric had already brought the main cast of Jurassic Park to Tokyo, Japan, to prepare for the movie's premiere on July 29. At the same time, the negotiations between Chris and the Nokia Group had also achieved some results. The main shareholders of the Nokia Group had agreed to divest the other companies that were not involved in the mobile communication business from the group. They would only continue to negotiate with Firefly for Nokia's mobile communication business. After this agreement was reached, the scale of assets involved in the entire negotiation would be reduced from $1 billion to about $700 million. At the same time, Eric also learned from Chris that because the launch of the GSM network was gradually recognized by European countries, more communication companies had begun to turn their attention to the research and development of GSM mobile phones. Once other mobile communication companies launched GSM mobile phones in time, the time and technical advantages accumulated by the Nokia Group would no longer exist. In this case, Nokia urgently needed a large amount of funds for the research and development of new mobile phones, and the marketing and promotion of the company's products. Therefore, Firefly's advantage in the negotiations would become more and more obvious. Since the scale of assets involved had been reduced to $700 million, Eric told Chris not to worry too much about the funds. The most important thing was to obtain more shares of Nokia's equity. After more understanding of the prospects of mobile phones, Chris also agreed with Eric's opinion. Eric and the publicity team settled in Chiyoda district in the center of Tokyo. Because of the continuous economic boom in Japan in the 1980s, it was the time when Japanese national self-esteem was at its highest. After Eric came to Tokyo, he could clearly feel the restlessness from the Japanese people he came into contact with. Tokyo in July was the hottest time of the year. In addition, he didn't have a good impression of this country. Eric didn't stay in Japan for too long. After attending the premiere, he left Japan in a hurry. However, many people in the team chose to stay and plan to travel in Tokyo. Except for a few countries across the sea, Japan's international image in the West was maintained very well, so most Westerners were very curious about Japan. In addition, Tokyo was the last stop for the promotion of Jurassic Park. Since the work had been completed, Eric didn't insist on anything. "Alan, I had a dream when I was a child. It was to be like a migratory bird, constantly migrating all year round, looking for a place where the temperature was always 23 degrees. After getting off the plane at Los Angeles International Airport with several entourages, Eric took a deep breath and said to Alan, who was walking beside him. Alan knew that Eric moved from London to Los Angeles with his father when he was 8 years old. He asked with a smile, "Your dream before you were 8 years old?" Eric was stunned and nodded. "Yes, the weather in London has always been very bad. I hate the wet and cold environment, I hate it very much." Alan smiled and asked, "Then what happened?" "Then," Eric waved his hand as if to hug the bright sunshine around him, "I found out that Los Angeles is actually such a place. As long as you are here, you don't have to migrate at all. It seems that you don't like to fly around the world," Alan concluded with a smile. "Of course," Eric also laughed. Eric did not inform too many people of his itinerary. When he walked out of the airport, several official cars sent by Firefly Pictures picked him up. Eric also found Jeffrey standing next to a commercial car with a smile. "Jeffrey, why did you come in person?" Eric greeted him with some surprise and hugged Jeffrey. "I happened to be free in the afternoon. I heard that you were coming back today, so I came in person," Jeffrey explained. Eric let the bodyguards who followed him around the world move freely. He sent Alan away before getting into a car with Jeffrey. "Is something the matter?" After the car started, Eric asked Jeffrey next to him. Jeffrey shook his head with a smile. "Are we already so distant from each other?" Eric was stunned for a moment. He then shook his head and said, "Of course not. I'm just a little surprised. I really don't have anything to do today. That's why I came in person," Jeffrey explained again. "However, there's a small matter. I went to New York last week and saw the two little guys." "Oh." Eric looked puzzled. "Kevin and Xiaxia are very cute," Jeffrey said. Then, as if he was a little embarrassed, he asked, "Eric, Emily has been in frequent contact with Joan and Vicky. You also have more contact with Chris than me. I just want you to help me ask when the two of them are getting married. It seems that caring about their children's marriage is a common problem for parents all over the world." Eric laughed in his heart and said, "Didn't they say that they plan to get married when they're 30? 30 years old." Jeffrey pursed his lips. "Then how old do you think Chris is now?" Eric was stunned. He remembered that when he first met Chris, he was 26 years old. Now 3 years had passed. 29 years old? Jeffrey nodded in distress. "Also, I know from Emily's father that Emily is actually 1 year older than Chris." Eric couldn't help but look distressed. He spread his hands and said, "Jeffrey, I can't help you with this matter. As a father, you need to nag them personally. You know, children are usually afraid of their parents nagging. If you nag them a few more times, they might not be able to resist it and get married." "Will this method work?" Jeffrey asked. Eric thought that Chris and Emily were the type of people with strong wills. This method probably wouldn't work. However, he couldn't think of a suitable method. "This is the only way I can think of." "Then I'll try." Jeffrey sighed and didn't continue to talk about this matter. He then asked, "I already know about the cooperation with the European Film Company. But don't you think that 30% of the shares is a bit low? With your current status, you can take 30% of a film's profits just by being the producer." "I don't think this matter is so simple." "Jeffrey, think about it. What does MGM have now?" Jeffrey was puzzled. 007? Eric smiled and said, "Yes, MGM now only has 007 as a bargaining chip. Of course, I'm not talking about that. I'm saying that MGM doesn't even have a film set now. All of it has been sold by that old guy, Kirk Cochran. He even changed it into MGM Hotel. Although the newly established DreamWorks Film Company will cooperate with MGM, in terms of production, DreamWorks Film Company still relies on Firefly's resources." Jeffrey nodded with some understanding. He knew that Eric's budget for 10 films was $800 million US. Based on the current average production cost of a film in Hollywood, it wasn't so easy to spend $800 million US on 10 films. The photography base and special effects company under Firefly Pictures would definitely take on most of the production work. In this way, even if they didn't use any illegal operations, Firefly Pictures could still make a lot of money in the production process. Speaking of which, Stan Winston has chosen the location of the new studio in Digital Domain. He plans to set it up in Florida. They've given him 3 years of tax exemption. The new branch company plans to build a studio of about 20,000 square meters in the capital of Florida. Jeffrey quickly talked about Firefly. Although Eric had been paying attention to all aspects of Firefly Pictures' business, it was impossible for him to know every detail. In addition, he had given Digital Domain full autonomy, so this was the first time he heard this news. However, Eric had no objections. 3 years of tax exemption was also a good condition for digital domain. If it were Eric, he would also agree. Although the development trend of special effects companies was to develop overseas, the profit margin of the special effects industry in North America was still very high. Special effects companies were in the era of aristocracy. A good special effects company would not have to worry about not getting projects at all. Even after the establishment of Firefly Software, and the establishment of more and more special effects studios, this wouldn't change for the time being. That works too. After the establishment of Firefly Software, there will definitely be more and more special effects companies in Los Angeles. Setting the branch company in Florida is also a good choice. Eric nodded and smiled again. He said, maybe in a few years we'll have to move the special effects company overseas. There shouldn't be a need for that, right? Jeffrey wondered. Who knows? Eric spread his hands. He couldn't explain too much to Jeffrey now. Chapter 551. Located at the Los Angeles International Airport, it was only about 5 kilometers away from Firefly Studios. Eric asked someone to send his luggage back to Malibu, and he went to Firefly Studios with Jeffrey. August was usually the busiest period for Hollywood studios. Although the summer break was coming to an end, most of the small and medium-sized productions targeted at the end of the year, as well as the big productions for the second summer break, had begun the formal production process during this period. Filming for the fall TV series also began at this time. Eric sat in the business car through the park and saw the busy scene in the studio. The studios on both sides of the main road of the studio were full of all kinds of vehicles, and the wide parking lot was also full of cars. After getting out of the car, Jeffrey and Eric walked out of the parking lot together and said, "Judging from the current situation, the 10 studios in the park are no longer enough to meet the needs. We discussed this issue at the regular meeting last week. We think that the expansion of the park to the west requires at least 5 more studios. The final plan will be out in a few days. You can come back and make the decision." "Well, we'll talk about it when the time comes." Eric nodded. He remembered that there were more than 20 studios on the Warner Burbank set. Although they were of different sizes, in terms of numbers, Firefly Studios were indeed a little small. However, Eric did not immediately express his opinion. It was best to wait until he saw the final expansion plan. After all, his personal ideas could not be better than the plans drawn up by Firefly's professional strategic development department. As for the management of Firefly, Eric usually only gave a negative opinion when the company's plan was not in line with the development trend of the film and television industry in his memory. Eric usually did not intervene in the details that he was not clear about, and did not worry about affecting the overall situation. It was impossible for no mistakes to be made in the development process of any company. After passing through the cement corridor outside the parking lot, they came to the small square bordering the studio and the digital domain office area. Jeffrey said, "Recently, Night Visit the Vampire has been filming here. Do you want to go and take a look?" Eric glanced at the crowded studio area and shook his head. "Not for the time being. I'll take some time to check the samples that have been shot." According to the plan, Firefly would release 3 films at the end of the year: Interview with the Vampire, Detective 2, and Pulp Fiction. Unless he was particularly interested in the successful commercial films in his previous life, Eric would usually shoot them according to the original version in his memory. As for films that he did not personally direct, Eric mainly controlled the script and post-production editing. At the same time, he would also look for the main creator who had a similar style to the original film. During the shooting process, unless the producer and director went crazy at the same time and acted recklessly, Eric would generally not interfere. This was something that Eric had never encountered before. Judging from the box office results of a series of films such as Island Horror, a few years ago, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith, in cooperation with Sony, Eric's plan was very effective. Moreover, in Hollywood, where the industrialization process was very complete, because the division of labor at each stage was very clear, there was not much resistance to this plan. There were very few directors in Hollywood who were strong enough to take all the control of the film. For someone like James Cameron, who had the strength to take control, Eric would be very assured to hand over the entire project to him. Compared to the hustle and bustle of the studio area, the digital domain was very orderly. Eric and Jeffrey chatted as they walked to the administrative building. From time to time, they would greet the employees they knew and did not know. Soon, they arrived at Eric's exclusive office in the studio. Because it had been empty for a long time, although it was still clean and tidy, the empty office was obviously less lively. Eric's assistant team office was located at the headquarters in Burbank, so there was no permanent secretary here. However, the general manager in charge of the park management quickly sent his secretary to help Eric and Jeffrey with some miscellaneous tasks such as making coffee. Sitting down in the office, Eric's mobile phone began to ring from time to time. Most of the calls were from the senior management of Firefly. A small number of calls were from various channels that Eric had returned to Los Angeles. However, everyone also knew that Eric had just finished a long flight, so they did not intend to disturb him. Jeffrey watched Eric sit down in the leather chair and skillfully turn on the computer on the desk. After drinking a cup of coffee brought by the secretary and chatting casually for a while, Jeffrey got up and said to Eric, "Since there's nothing else, I'll leave first. You just came back, don't be busy for too long. Go back and rest early. I'll send you off." Eric also got up and sent Jeffrey into the elevator before returning to the office. Although the internet was developing very quickly, Hotmail's online email service was still limited to the United States. This also caused Eric to be unable to use email to communicate with other parties in a timely manner after he left the United States. This was also something that Eric was very troubled about when he was in Europe and Japan. After sending Jeffrey off, Eric connected to the internet and opened the Internet Explorer browser. Yahoo's homepage quickly popped up. After the Yahoo portal was launched at the end of last year, Eric proposed many of his ideas to the Yahoo technical team based on his memories from his previous life. Based on Eric's suggestions and the current hardware and software conditions, the Yahoo team once again revised the homepage. At this time, Eric saw the new Yahoo homepage. From top to bottom, the theme box on the left was Hotmail, Yahoo News, and Yahoo Forum. On the right was the URL navigation interface, including the search function. In his previous life, Eric saw Yahoo's homepage in the computer room of his university in 1995. What left the deepest impression on Eric was the Yahoo homepage at that time. The Yahoo logo on both sides gave the impression that there were 4 mahjong tiles on the homepage. Coupled with the exaggerated design of the homepage, it was very funny when he thought about it now. Since he had the opportunity to control everything, Eric's suggestion to the team was to be concise, and more concise. To make it look more pleasing to the eye, Eric even removed the exclamation mark behind Yahoo. Yahoo News and Yahoo Forum were both launched under Eric's suggestion. In Eric's vision, Yahoo News section would become bigger and bigger. Eventually, Yahoo would transform into a news and information portal. But with the current scale of internet users, Yahoo News could not compete with print media and television media. It was still in the exploration stage. At this stage, Yahoo's main focus was on the development of the forum. In order to quickly expand the size of the forum users, Yahoo directly connected to the Hotmail user group and did not establish a separate user database. Although this was criticized by the Yahoo team, this measure was quickly implemented under the insistence of the boss Eric. After Yahoo and Hotmail developed separately for a few years, Eric planned to integrate the two companies. After all, with Hotmail, Eric could no longer let Yahoo develop a separate email service. Although Yahoo News had just developed, through cooperation with some media, the information in Yahoo News section was much more than the few newspapers that ordinary people read every day. Although a lot of the information was a bit outdated, it was just right for Eric, who had not paid attention to domestic affairs in the United States for a long time. Opening the information section, Eric quickly found some of the information about Hollywood that he was most interested in through the search function. In addition to a lot of news about the box office of Jurassic Park, the biggest thing that happened in Hollywood in the past year was, of course, the bidding of Paramount by the two companies, Viacom and QVC. After the two parties failed to increase the price at the beginning of the year, There were several small-scale confrontations during this period. But then, in order to accumulate more power, Viacom's Lei Sherdong turned to the largest video rental company in the United States, Blockbuster, halfway through the merger. Viacom changed its target, and Paramount temporarily put the negotiations with QVC on hold. From some recent news, Lei Sherdong had basically completed the negotiations with Blockbuster. It was expected that the merger between the two parties would be completed by September at the latest. Once Viacom took over Blockbuster, with the huge cash flow of the video rental company and the debt financing brought by this asset mortgage, the chances of Viacom taking over Paramount would be greatly increased. As for QVC, although Barry Diller did not relax his efforts to acquire Paramount, one of the two shareholders of QVC, Telcom, had begun merger negotiations with another telecommunications giant in the United States, AT&T, and the subject of this merger was AT&T. Once AT&T completed the merger of Telcom, the support for QVC's acquisition of Paramount would be halved. Therefore, most of the media in the United States were not optimistic about Barry Diller's acquisition of Paramount. After Eric read the news, he was thinking about something else. In his memory, after Viacom completed the acquisition of Paramount with a huge investment of $10 billion USD, a few years later, because of the rise of an online rental chain called Netflix, the business and market value of Blockbuster, which Viacom had acquired with a huge sum of money, shrank sharply. Thinking of Netflix, Eric's habitual mischievous smile appeared on his face again. However, this matter was not urgent. To establish Netflix, he first had to implement convenient online payment channels. To achieve convenient online payment, he had to develop e-commerce. Everything had to be done step by step. Eric sighed, but he closed the Yahoo News page and opened the Yahoo Forum. Because of the limitations of the network, the Yahoo Forum currently only provided a targeted theme section. If users wanted to create a theme forum that they were interested in, they could only build their own forum website. However, in any case, the Yahoo Forum with the Hotmail user group was definitely the largest communication community on the internet. Online communication forums were very new to many internet users. Eric randomly selected a few forums and browsed through them. He found that the users in each section were very active. However, he also found some small problems. The users in the forums had no other identifiers except for their personal nicknames. In his memory, the simplest user identification was, of course, the level division. Moreover, introducing a user-level system could also greatly increase the user's stickiness on the website. Just like in online games, low-level accounts were often abandoned, but the higher the level, the more reluctant the players were to abandon them. After thinking about it for a while, Eric opened his email and intended to send this suggestion to the teams of Yahoo and Hotmail. Because the forum used the Hotmail user group, the introduction of the new function must be negotiated between the two parties. Although Eric was not in the United States during this time, his mailbox still accumulated dozens of unread emails from various sources. Now, the number of emails stored in an ordinary user's mailbox was of course limited, but this problem did not exist for Eric. First, he wrote the idea and sent it out. Then, Eric began to deal with the accumulated emails in his mailbox. When he was almost done reading the emails, he suddenly heard a new email notification. He glanced at it. It was from the current head of the Hotmail company, the person named Steve Mitnick that Chris mentioned. Eric opened it curiously and found only one sentence. What is user stickiness? Because English was written in phonetic alphabets, if there was no special explanation, although most people could read a new word according to common grammar, it was impossible to know what it meant. This was also the reason why Westerners often suffered from dyslexia. When Eric first sent the email, it was impossible for him to create a new word. He just pieced together the two words stickiness and degree into a new phrase. He did not know if it was appropriate. Seeing the other party's question, Eric thought for a moment and quickly typed out an explanation. Soon, another email appeared on the computer. It was still from Steve Mitnick. Very interesting theory. You are also a very interesting person. Eric replied, if you are praising me, then thank you. After dozens of seconds, the reply came again. Of course I am praising you. To us you are Jesus. Eric was surprised. Why do you say that? Steve Mitnick. Because you've already invested more than $50 million into 3 companies without any profit prospects. That's a lot of money. In the past, we didn't have enough money to realize many of your ideas, but now we can do these things. So of course you're like Jesus to us. Eric could not help but laugh. I am just investing in the future. Steve Mitnick. Can you see the future? Eric. I can't answer this question, but I can see the future now. Steve Mitnick. Oh what? Eric. Instant messaging software. If we can develop an instant messaging software, then we won't have to chat through email. Do you think this idea is promising? The other side was silent for a moment before replying. Very good idea, and the technical requirements are not high. Give me $5 million, and I will produce the finished product in 3 months. Eric replied decisively, no problem. Also, you are a very interesting person. Let's meet when we have time. Steve Mitnick. Okay. Chapter 552. The place that countless dreamers in Hollywood yearned for was undoubtedly the countless parties. Regardless of whether it was spring, summer, autumn, or winter, they could be found all over Los Angeles. From the lowest level of extras to the top superstars, participating in all kinds of parties was the fastest way to better integrate into Hollywood. At this time, a scene of debauchery was playing out in a mansion in Beverly Hills. Night had just enveloped Los Angeles when countless men and women gathered in the hall, pool, and lawn inside and outside the mansion. Many of them were familiar faces from the big screen. As for the reason for the party, it was said that the owner of the mansion, a slightly famous producer in Hollywood, was celebrating the birthday of his new girlfriend. However, not many people seemed to care about this. Amidst the fiery rhythm of the music, 2 young men sat at the bar in the master's hall and ordered 2 bottles of beer from the waiter. The brown-haired young man drank half a bottle in a heroic manner. Looking at the men and women dancing wildly on the dance floor, he said to the blonde-haired young man beside him, "Luke, this place is amazing. Thank you for bringing me here." The blonde-haired young man named Luke clinked his bottle with the other party and smiled. "It's nothing. I happen to know Tony. Matthew, I brought you here to celebrate the good role you just got." Matthew couldn't help but show a slightly proud smile. Speaking of which, this audition was really lucky. Paramount had already confirmed the supporting role. But that unlucky guy got caught driving drunk the night he got the role. Haha, although there were 2 strong competitors later, my agent pulled some tricks and got it. Haha. I heard that I'll even be able to act with Harrison Ford. Jamie said that as long as I can use this film to deepen the audience's impression of me, I can fight for the lead role in a small-budget movie next. Luke listened to Matthew talk about his experience of getting the role and felt jealous, but he didn't show it at all. He continued to chat with the other party happily. At this time, a few cheers sounded on the dance floor, attracting the attention of the 2 young men. Matthew turned his head and saw a figure dancing crazily on the dance floor like a mermaid. The girl was not too tall, wearing a tank top and denim hot pants. Although the lights were not too bright, the 2 could still clearly see the girl's white skin and beautiful baby face. For some reason, although the dance floor was very crowded, and many of the girls were taken advantage of by the men, and the scene of the baby-faced girl casually pulling the girls beside her for a face-to-face dance made the men who noticed this scene even more excited. However, not a single man approached the baby-faced girl. "It's Drew Barrymore. That chick is really hot." Matthew stared at the fair waist of the girl on the dance floor as he drank a mouthful of beer with a fervent gaze. Luke noticed his friend's gaze, and his expression flickered. He suddenly said, "Do you still remember the movie Buffy the Vampire Slayer that you participated in last time?" Matthew stared intently at the girl not far away and nodded. "Of course, what's the matter?" "The movie has been adapted into a TV series. I heard that it was produced by the production company of Drew Barrymore, Julia Roberts, and Murdoch's daughter." Matthew couldn't help but touch his chin, thinking that this was a good excuse to strike up a conversation. However, although he hadn't been in Hollywood for long, he still knew some of the gossip in the circle. Besides, the incident a few years ago was so big that it was impossible for him not to know. "Luke, I heard that Drew Barrymore is Eric Williams' woman, right? Luke said casually. Who knows? That was 3 years ago. In Hollywood, do you think there is a relationship that can last for 3 years? Matthew thought that he had entered the Hollywood circle, so of course he couldn't show his cowardice. He pretended to be very knowledgeable and nodded. Then, he glanced at the baby-faced girl on the dance floor, and automatically imagined that the reason why she was supported by TG might be Eric Williams' compensation to his former lover. If he could hook her, then with Drew Barrymore's connections, he could at least struggle in Hollywood for 5 years. No, maybe 10 years. After all, Drew Barrymore's godfather was Steven Spielberg. The more he thought about it, the more excited he became. Matthew threw away the bottle in his hand, straightened his clothes, and walked to the dance floor. However, he didn't notice the obvious gloating on his friend's face. The dance floor was as crowded as a can of fish. Matthew's participation didn't attract anyone's attention at first, but as Matthew moved his body closer to Drew, more and more people became aware of his movements. Many people couldn't help but slow down a lot. Some people even whispered to each other and quickly spread the news, as if a good show was about to begin. Hi Drew, my name is Matthew. Matthew finally got close to the girl and introduced himself casually. The girl, who was originally squinting her eyes and dancing to the music, found that there was a man beside her. A look of surprise appeared on her fair-skinned baby face, but she didn't stop dancing. She just smiled sweetly at him and greeted, "Hi Matthew." When Matthew saw the girl's sweet smile, his heart throbbed inexplicably. At the same time, he felt that his chances of success had greatly increased. He leaned toward the girl confidently and hesitated to reach out and hold her seductive waist. He continued, "I heard that your company is producing Buffy the Vampire Slayer. What a coincidence. I just acted in the movie version." Wow, really? Drew looked very interested. "You Matthew?" "Matthew Abrams. I'm from Canada. Did Tony invite you here?" Drew asked again. Matthew hesitated for a moment. Then he raised his chin toward his friend outside the dance floor and said, "My friend brought me here." Luke, who was originally sitting by the bar, waiting for the show to begin, saw his good friend's actions on the dance floor and immediately realized that something was wrong. He noticed that the beautiful baby face immediately looked over and couldn't help but shiver. Seeing that the two of them immediately withdrew their gazes and continued chatting, Luke didn't hesitate at all. He got up and walked out, and after a minute or so he drove out of the bustling party. Drew looked at the man who had come closer to her. She grabbed half a bottle of champagne from a drunken girl next to her. When Matthew saw Drew's action, he immediately said, "Drew, I think you'd better not drink this kind of champagne." The smile on the girl's face remained unchanged, but she didn't put the half bottle of champagne to her mouth. "Matthew, right?" A hurt look appeared on Matthew's face. "I think I've already introduced you. I just want to confirm it again," Drew said with a smile. "Matthew, didn't your good friend tell you something just now?" Matthew didn't notice that Drew had deliberately emphasized a certain word. He pretended to be cool and said, "I don't think he has anything to tell me." The girl glanced outside the dance floor and found that the figure had disappeared. The smile on her baby face became even sweeter. She said to Matthew, "Then you're really pitiful." Matthew thought that he had heard wrongly. He moved closer to the girl, stretched out his hand, and pretended to put it on Drew's waist. "What did you say?" he asked. The girl took a step back nimbly, dodging the other party's outstretched hand. She raised her voice and said, "I mean, you're really pitiful." Along with this sentence, the champagne bottle flew towards Matthew's handsome face in a dark green blur. With a muffled bang, the glass fragments mixed with wine splashed radially in all directions. It could be seen how much strength was spared in the blow just now. Along with the sound of glass shattering, the men and women on the dance floor who were paying attention to this matter had a rush of adrenaline secretion, and they burst into cheers of excitement. "Ah, cool. Again. Matthew, who was hit in the face by the champagne bottle, had a buzzing sound in his head. It wasn't until he heard the cheers around him that he woke up a little. He touched his bleeding cheekbone and realized the risk of disfigurement and the loss of the role that he had just obtained. A hysterical anger suddenly arose in his heart. He pounced on Drew with a ferocious look on his face. However, he directly bumped into two women who were similar in size to him. Then, he felt that he was pushed hard. The moment he fell to the ground and passed out, he could barely distinguish the faces of two identical Russian women. At this time, the owner of the mansion who had received the news had rushed over. Looking at the girl who was empty-handed and had an innocent look on her face, he smiled bitterly and said, "Drew, you've caused me trouble again." "It's not my fault, Tony. Who told you to have such an unruly guy in your house?" Tony squatted on the ground to check on the unconscious young man. Except for a miserable wound on his left cheekbone, there seemed to be no other major problems. However, a mild concussion was definitely unavoidable. Tony instructed the waiter to help the unlucky guy deal with the wound. After that, he got up and said to Drew, "Well, I'll take care of it here. But Drew, I think you should leave." The girl shook her head indifferently. "I haven't had enough fun yet. I'm not leaving." "I mean, don't you know?" Tony leaned a little closer and whispered in the girl's ear, "Mr. Williams should be back in the afternoon." "Wow." The girl cheered excitedly and ran out. The Russian twins who had just stopped Matthew quickly followed. The owner of the mansion, Tony, looked enviously at the Russian twins who left with the little girl. Tony was a boxing enthusiast. In June, he happened to see the introduction of the Russian twins in Sports Illustrated. They were a pair of twin sisters who had been unearthed from Russia by a famous boxing agent, Sean Kim. Not only did the two sisters have the perfect hot figure, but they also had a pair of exquisite faces that were unique to East Slavic beauties. Tony had specially inquired about the schedule of the sisters' matches, and planned to watch them when the time came. He didn't expect that inexplicably, the sisters would appear here as the bodyguards of the little girl Drew. What a waste, Tony sighed. As a famous producer in Hollywood, he did not care much about women. Instead, the confrontation in the boxing ring could arouse his interest. He felt that if he could see the two identical beautiful sisters fighting in the boxing ring, the sensory stimulation would definitely be better than King 100 different women. The burly off-road vehicle had just arrived at the open space outside the Pointy Corner Manor when the girl saw the light in the villa. She excitedly shouted to the woman driving in the front seat, "Natasha, stop the car. Just stop here." "Okay, boss." The Russian woman named Natasha responded and quickly parked the car. The girl opened the door and jumped out, but she did not run to the villa. Instead, she patted the window of the driver's seat and said, "Natasha, come out. Come with me to see Eric." "Okay, boss." The woman who had just responded again. In the afternoon, Eric dealt with some matters in the office in the studio. After that, he rushed back to the Pointy Corner Manor. After dinner, Eric stayed in a living room on the east side of the villa hall and flipped through the recent newspapers. "Eric, you're finally back." The girl pushed open the door of the living room. When she saw Eric's figure, she immediately pounced on him and pressed Eric down on the sofa. Eric threw the newspaper in his hand aside and pressed down on Drew, who was moving around. He sniffled and asked in a doting manner, "You drank, right? Where did you go to have fun?" The girl snorted and did not answer Eric's question. Instead, she pointed at the Russian sisters who had followed her in and were quietly standing at the door. "Eric, look, they're my new bodyguards. What do you think?" The TV in the living room was still on. Eric noticed the movement at the door. He looked in the direction of Drew's finger and raised his eyebrows in surprise. He reached out and gently pulled Drew's ear. "What nonsense are you up to this time?" The girl squeaked and said, "They're really my bodyguards. I snatched them from that old guy, Sean Kim. I spent a lot of money on them." Eric did not care about the boxing competition at all. Of course, he did not know about the famous Sean Kim. He waved at the two women at the door and said, "Come and sit down." The twin sisters were wearing the same white t-shirt and white jeans. There was no difference in their appearance. When Eric said that sentence, the girl standing on the left was confused. However, the girl on the right looked at Drew. "Eric is also your boss. He said the same thing as me," the girl said to the two of them. When the girl on the right heard Drew's words, she pulled the sister on the left and walked over together. They sat down on the single sofa that Eric had just pointed at. Eric looked at the two sisters, who were tall but didn't seem crowded at all on the single sofa. He asked, "Are you models?" "No, boss." The girl who had just replied said again. The girl who was still leaning on Eric smiled and said, "Eric, I snatched them from Sean Kim. How can they be models?" Eric had to ask, "Who is Sean Kim?" He is a famous boxing agent in the WBA. How can you not know him?" "Why should I know him? A boxing agent. Are they boxers?" Eric looked at the twin sisters again. From their appearance, the two sisters had a somewhat cold temperament. However, they did not have the characteristics of boxers. Instead, when he suddenly saw each other's delicate faces, he would think that the two girls were models. However, Eric remembered that many famous models had the hobby of boxing in order to maintain their figures. Female boxers did not necessarily have obvious muscle lines like male boxers. Instead, their figures were more well-proportioned and hot. Seeing that Eric finally reacted, the girl nodded and said, "Yes, they are very powerful." "Oh, how powerful can they be?" Eric chuckled and shook his head. Without waiting for the girl to answer, he asked, "What are their names?" "Natasha." Eric waited for a while. Seeing that Drew did not continue, he said, "Natasha?" The girl scratched her head awkwardly and said with a smile, "Anyway, they are exactly the same. Just call them Natasha. The other name is very hard to pronounce. I can't remember it." As Drew spoke, he turned his head to look at the two girls and accurately found the girl who had just spoken. "What are your names?" "Boss, my name is Natasha Sokolov. I am the elder sister. My younger sister is Yevgenia Sokolov." Eric could almost see at this time that the elder twin sister, Natasha, knew some English, but the younger sister obviously did not. However, Natasha's English was not that fluent. Eric could barely pronounce the younger sister's name, but he really could not remember it after hearing it once. Eric was a little confused and wanted to ask Drew alone. He said, "Drew should have arranged accommodation for you. Go and rest." Natasha nodded obediently at Eric and pulled her younger sister out. "Okay, tell me, what's going on with them?" Eric asked after the two girls left. The two of them were originally discovered by Sean Kim from Moscow. I don't know the details, but I saw the two of them in a pictorial last month. I thought they were very interesting, so I asked ICM's agent to help me contact them. I agreed to help them and their families immigrate to the United States. As a condition, the two of them have to be my bodyguards. The price I offered was much more expensive than that old man Sean Kim. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, in addition to the wealth that the Soviet Union had accumulated for more than half a century being swept away, the former Soviet Union countries fell into an economic winter where basic necessities could not be guaranteed. As long as the former Soviet Union had some ability, they began to flee. Thus, a large-scale immigration wave was formed. Some countries even specially set up various departments to search for talent resources from the former Soviet Union. Eric had experienced these things in both his lives. He guessed that the sisters were part of the immigration wave. Eric looked at the little girl in his arms. He sighed in his heart. He did not know if they were lucky or unlucky to fall into the hands of this little girl. You can handle these things yourself. Don't cause trouble. Also, treat them well. They are a group of pitiful people. Eric couldn't help but sigh when he thought of the photos of the former Soviet Union residents' living conditions that were published in the newspapers 2 years ago. Of course, I spent a lot of money to buy them. The little girl giggled. Eric pinched the little girl's face. They are people, not goods. Drew rubbed her face against Eric's palm and giggled. Anyway, I bought them. Eric, you bought me too. I'm more expensive. $1 million. Chapter 553. Perhaps it was because there were too many movies in his mind, but Eric's dreams were always a little strange. When he was about to wake up, he randomly entered Resident Evil. He didn't know who he was, and he only knew that he had entered a messy hall with his companions. He was moving forward carefully when a drop of unknown liquid fell on his face. He raised his head abruptly and saw Lord Lick's ferocious tongue attacking him in the dark. He instantly woke up in fright. At a glance he saw Drew, who was already neatly dressed, lying next to him with a smile. It was rare for this little girl to wake up earlier than him. Eric was not surprised. After circling around the Earth for a long time, his biological clock was a bit messed up. It would probably take a while for him to recover. Thinking of the dream just now, Eric touched his cheek and asked, "Little girl, you didn't prank me by drawing something on my face, right?" "Of course not." Drew showed an expression that said, "Do you think I'm still a child?" Then she gave an answer that made Eric feel a little helpless. "I just licked it a few times." "Well, it's not like I'll lose a piece of meat anyway," Eric thought to himself and reached out to take the watch on the table. Drew's small body just happened to block in front of him, so he asked, "What time is it now?" Drew turned around and pressed a button next to the bed. The curtains around the bedroom silently opened, and the bright sunlight rushed in and quickly filled the spacious master bedroom. Eric narrowed his eyes and used his arm to block the sunlight. Then he suddenly sat up. Yesterday, he had an appointment to hold a Firefly management meeting in the morning. It looked like he was going to be late. Hurriedly putting on his clothes, Eric asked, "Where's my mobile phone? Did anyone call?" "Yes, Michael just called and asked if you were going to attend the meeting today. I said you were still jet-lagged and might be a little late, so he changed the meeting to 1 o'clock in the afternoon." Drew said as she found a brand new tie from the cabinet, and excitedly rushed over to help Eric put it on. Eric could only stand there and take a look at his watch. It was already 9:40. Even if he rushed over now, he wouldn't have enough time in the morning. "Next time you encounter this kind of thing, you must wake me up. It's not good to let so many people wait." Drew obviously also knew the priorities of the matter and said, "I know, this time is a little special. You just came back from Tokyo, they can understand." When he went downstairs to the dining room for breakfast, the Russian twins appeared again and took the initiative to greet Eric. After Eric sat down, they put breakfast and today's newspaper in front of Eric. They seemed to be well trained. The little girl who had already eaten breakfast sat opposite Eric with her little chin in her hand. Her eyes suddenly flashed with a look that said, "Praise me quickly." Eric thanked the twins. After the sisters left the dining room, he picked up a small piece of bread and threw it at the girl's head. "Well, what's there to be proud of? You spent so much money, it's enough to hire 100 servants." Although Drew joked last night that she was more expensive, in fact, she only bought the sisters' contract from the agent named Sean Kim for $800,000. She took advantage of the loopholes in the other party's contract and promised various conditions to the two sisters. Just the cost of helping the sisters and their families emigrate was more than $800,000. "I can also let the two of them make cameo appearances in the company's movies. In the future, the two of them will be mascots in the movies of Flower Pictures. They'll be more eye-catching than your little girl holding a doll gimmick." Eric ignored the ridicule in the girl's tone and asked, "You said you'll help their family emigrate. It's not so easy to emigrate from Russia to the United States now, right? What does their family do?" "Their father was originally a very good boxing coach. But you know, Russia is so poor now that they can't even afford the hotel room when the president goes abroad for meetings. A boxing coach is even more useless. However, it's different in the Federation, and they don't have many family members. Other than the two of them, there are only their parents and a younger brother. It's not difficult." Seeing that the girl knew everything, Eric didn't ask any more questions. He took a sip of milk and flipped open a newspaper at the same time. "Eric, you always read these, what's the use?" The girl came over to find a topic. Looking for inspiration, Eric simply spat out 2 words. He saw from the Los Angeles Times that yesterday afternoon, MGM CEO Frank Marchese held a press conference and announced the plan to cooperate with Firefly Pictures to establish a DreamWorks film production company. He also revealed the production plans for Thunderbolt Girls and Resident Evil, as well as the news that Eric was about to participate in the production of the latest 007 movie. Drew didn't mind Eric's perfunctory answer. She dragged a chair over to read the press release together. When Eric was in Europe, he had already called her to tell her about the decision on the Thunderbolt Girls project. Drew already knew about it. "Eric, the press release doesn't mention the representative of Firefly Pictures. Is this a one-sided press conference held by MGM?" From the press release, Not only did Firefly Pictures representative not attend the press conference, but Frank Marcheso also deliberately downplayed the role of European capital in the production company in the content of the press conference. Eric thought that MGM's stock price would definitely rise recently, so he explained to Drew, MGM needs some good news right now, so they can't wait to do this. This is nothing. Frank Marcheso must have communicated with Michael and the rest. Firefly is not a listed company, so this news won't affect us too much. Oh Eric, we won't lose out by giving Thunderbolt Girls to MGM, right? This movie is similar to 007 style. Maybe there will be many sequels? The copyright is placed in DreamWorks, not MGM. We own 30% of DreamWorks shares, so we are already the biggest shareholder. Moreover, most of the shares are with European capital. If we have a conflict with MGM, which side do you think the European capital will stand on? Of course it's on our side. Hey Eric, I just thought of a good idea. Say if we let the Thunderbolt Girls series and 007 overlap. Wouldn't it be a good idea? That's a good idea, but unless Thunderbolt Charming Baby achieves the same level of influence and box office results as James Bond, it won't be easy. The influence of the James Bond series has been accumulated over decades. Drew also knew that the influence of the 007 series was definitely not something that Thunderbolt Girls, which had yet to be released on the big screen, could compare. He took a step back and asked, what if it's just some plot Easter eggs? Then we'll have to wait until the first movie achieves enough influence, but it's not like we can't give it a try. The most important thing now is to do a good job with the first Thunderbolt Girls. Although Eric did not think highly of Drew's sudden idea during breakfast, he became more and more interested in it. If there was an overlap between Thunderbolt Girls and 007 series, it would definitely be a very strong gimmick. However, when he thought of the box office results of the Thunderbolt Girls series in his previous life, Eric could only wait until the results of the new version of Thunderbolt Girls were released before he started the related work. Although the meeting was changed to the afternoon, Eric still rushed to Firefly's headquarters immediately after breakfast. Firefly Pictures had accumulated a large number of documents that required Eric's personal review. Eric arrived at the office at 11 o'clock, and by the time the meeting started in the afternoon, he had only read less than 1/10 of the documents. This was under the condition that he had missed lunch. Fortunately, Eric had a late breakfast, so he was not too hungry. The meeting in the afternoon was not considered large. It was just a small meeting of more than 10 senior executives of Firefly. Eric walked into the conference room with Alan, who was holding a thick stack of documents. When he saw Michael Lynn and Jeffrey Katzenberg, everyone's gazes gathered on him. He smiled and said, "Long time no see. It seems that everyone misses me." With a chuckle, Eric took the opportunity to exchange a few words with everyone while Alan was distributing the documents one by one. After Alan finished distributing the documents, Eric stood up and said, "I know that Firefly has a lot of things to deal with recently, but we're not going to talk about these today. Today we're talking about the next stage of development of Firefly Pictures." At this time, the senior executives in the meeting room had already opened the documents in their hands. Whether they had received the news in advance or not, they were not too surprised when they saw the contents of the documents. The contents of the documents were an evaluation of the possibility of acquisition of the 3 major television networks. Firefly Pictures' current situation had already surpassed the other 6 major film companies in Hollywood with an absolute advantage. If they wanted to go further, they would have to move from a film company to a comprehensive media group. Although it would take some time for them to formally propose an acquisition of the television networks, and they might even have to wait until next year, the preparation work must be done as soon as possible. Among the 3 major television networks in North America, except for Fox, after the wave of mergers and acquisitions in the mid-1980s, ABC TV, which had been in a bad situation in the first few years, had become the one with the best overall situation at this time. This was because since 1983, when Metropolitan Communications and Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway acquired ABC, the new shareholders strengthened the financial supervision of ABC TV, but at the same time, they gave the management enough time to make full use of the potential. Although ABC's current profitability was still not too obvious, it was already in a period of benign development. Later, NBC TV was still in a turbulent stage because of the conflict between the management and the parent company, General Electric Group. The situation of CBS could only be described as bad. In the mid-1980s, after Wall Street investor Lawrence Tisch obtained control of CBS, he sold a large number of CBS's business assets, including the world's second-largest record company, Columbia Records, which was sold to the Japanese. After so many years of capital operations and reaping enough benefits, Lawrence Tisch didn't want to play anymore. He was looking for someone to take over the business. Therefore, CBS was also the easiest to acquire. However, with the current strength of Firefly Pictures, there was no need to pick up scraps. Since they were going to buy, of course they had to choose the best, ABC, followed by NBC, and CBS was the last choice. After Eric briefly introduced the plan in his mind, Michael Lynn said, "Eric, since we are going to buy ABC, we must sell the Fox TV network shares in our hands, right? I will talk to Mr. Murdoch about this in person soon." Someone else asked, "What about Friends, The X-Files, and Who Will Be a Millionaire?" Friends signed a 5-season broadcast contract with Fox, and this year was the 5th season. Moreover, the copyright of Friends was completely in the hands of Firefly. Eric certainly would not be polite with Fox. He said, "After completing this year's contract, we will definitely not renew it with them. As for The X-Files and Who Will Be a Millionaire, we will continue to maintain the original plan." The X-Files and Who Will Be a Millionaire shared the copyright development with Fox. It would be very difficult to snatch them away. Moreover, if they snatched all 3 pillars of Fox in one go, it would be strange if Murdoch did not turn hostile. As Eric spoke, he looked at Firefly's vice president in charge of the TV department. In addition, from now on, the TV department can look for all the programs. Even if it may take 1 or 2 years for us to acquire the TV network, we can still stock up on some good projects by doing this. Come up with a plan as soon as possible and send the project summaries to me regularly. Katzenberg suddenly said, "Eric, are you going to be personally responsible for the acquisition of the TV network?" As soon as Katzenberg's voice fell, the atmosphere in the conference room suddenly became a little strange. Many people glanced between Katzenberg and Michael Lynn. Eric also had a headache at this time as he looked at Katzenberg and Michael Lynn sitting on both sides of him. The acquisition of the TV network was such a big deal that it would definitely require a senior executive at the level of the president of Firefly Pictures to follow up and personally conduct the relevant negotiations at any time. If it was under other circumstances, this burden would definitely fall on Michael Lynn. But the current situation was that Eric had promised Katzenberg last year that when Michael Lynn's contract expired next year, he would appoint Katzenberg as Firefly's CEO. As the current CEO of Firefly Pictures, although Michael Lynn was somewhat conservative and did not have Katzenberg's indomitable spirit, he had always been a very qualified manager. Although Eric did not often intervene in the management of the company, Michael Lynn could perfectly execute every inadvertent order he gave. Eric was very satisfied with Michael Lynn. Therefore, even before Katzenberg spoke, Eric had been struggling for a long time about how to arrange for Michael Lynn in the future. Chapter 554. After a moment of hesitation, Eric looked at Carson and said, "I will be personally responsible for the preparatory stage of the acquisition of ABC for the time being. I will make the corresponding adjustments after the formal negotiations begin." When Carson heard this answer, he shrugged slightly to show that he understood, but there was inevitably some disappointment on his face. After the meeting, Eric noticed that Jeffrey had just winked at him, so he pretended to pack up the documents and stayed at the back. After everyone in the conference room left, Eric said to Jeffrey, "Am I a little too indecisive?" Jeffrey came to Eric's side, leaned on the large mahogany desk, and looked kindly at the tired young man leaning on the leather chair. He said, "I remember reading a saying somewhere that huge wealth often makes people indifferent. So, Eric, I hope you can be more humane. If you did not hesitate to abandon Michael and hand over the acquisition to Jeffrey, I think most of the people in the conference room would feel uneasy. Michael's achievements since he became the CEO of Firefly are obvious to all. Compared to Peter Guber, who made Columbia Pictures a mess, Michael Lynn, who was conservative but very steady, had taken care of everything in Firefly Pictures in the past 2 years. Moreover, in the face of Jeffrey Carson, a subsidiary company of Disney, who was ready to take over his position at any time, Michael Lynn did not choose internal strife like the management of Time Warner to ensure his position. These were all things that Eric appreciated and valued very much. If possible, Eric would continue to keep Michael Lynn at Firefly. In reality, a company could have 2 co-presidents, just like Warner during Steve Ross's time, but there could only be one CEO as the commander. Moreover, Eric had never heard of a situation where the CEO of a large group switched positions with his subordinates. Once the position was replaced by others, the predecessor would either be promoted to a virtual title and serve as the chairman of the board of directors, which maintained influence in the company but did not have much decision-making power, or leave directly. Most of Firefly's shares were concentrated in Eric's hands, so there was no board of directors. Even if there was a board of directors in the future, the position of chairman of the board of directors could not fall to anyone other than Eric. Therefore, once Michael Lynn resigned, he could only choose to leave Firefly completely. Michael is only 50 this year, right? For Westerners who generally refused to accept old age, 50 years old was still considered to be in the prime of life. 52 years old, Jeffrey said. He reached out and patted Eric on the shoulder. Eric, I used to think that many of your decisions were very risky, but now I know that you must have had a card up your sleeve. From this point of view, compared to Jeffrey's drive, you are a little conservative. Jeffrey will take over Michael's position, and it will complement you. So Eric, have a good talk with Michael. The change of Hollywood executives is a very common thing, and Michael is now only in his early 50s. After leaving Firefly, he has enough time to do other things. He had to face what he had to face. Eric took a deep breath, got up and said, "There is still some time before I get off work. I'll go over now." Michael Lynn's secretary was answering the phone. When she saw Eric coming over, she quickly covered the microphone and looked at Eric with an inquiring look. "Help me and Michael make 2 cups of coffee and send it in," Eric said to the secretary. He knocked on Michael's office door a few times, pushed the door open and walked in. Michael Lynn saw Eric coming in. His eyes were a little surprised at first, but soon he showed a relieved expression. He stood up and invited Eric to sit down on the sofa in the lounge area. He smiled and said, "Eric, did I make things difficult for you just now?" Eric showed an embarrassed expression. Most of the executives of Firefly could realize that Eric wanted Katzenberg to take over. Of course, it was impossible for Michael Lynn not to know. Michael Lynn's secretary pushed the door in with 2 cups of coffee and quickly left. Eric sorted out his words and was about to speak when Michael Lynn said, "Eric, Firefly is getting bigger and bigger. I find that I am a little powerless in many things. In fact, I have already thought about it. When my contract expires next year, I will take the initiative to resign and leave the company to do something else." This time, it was Eric's turn to be surprised. Michael Lynn looked at Eric's surprised expression, smiled slightly and continued, "My contract expires in April next year, so I will start handing over the work of Firefly at the beginning of next year. In fact, I also think that Jeffrey is more suitable for this position than me." Eric originally thought that this conversation would develop into a quarrel. He did not expect the situation to be far beyond his expectations. "Michael, then what are you going to do after leaving Firefly?" "Maybe I will take a break first and spend more time with my family. In addition, I like red wine very much. I plan to go to Europe and find a decent winery. After the break, I will definitely return to Hollywood. You know, I have been in this industry since 1967 and have been in it for more than 20 years. It is impossible for me to leave this industry now. When the time comes, I will set up my own production company." Eric slowly recovered and said to Michael Lynn, "If you need help, you can call me at any time. Of course, if possible, I also hope that you can help me pick out a script at that time." Eric felt relieved and readily agreed. "Of course, this is no problem." Speaking of which, except for the company's party, We haven't talked in private. Let's have dinner together tonight? There is a good Michelin restaurant on Amanda Street. I often go there. Let's try it tonight? Okay, it's my treat. Eric originally wanted to invite Michael to the Sharp Corner Manor, but since the other party personally recommended it, he did not refuse. Of course it's your treat. Michael Lynn laughed heartily and said, Then I will ask my secretary to make a reservation. See you tonight. See you tonight. After sending Eric out of the office, Michael Lynn sat back in his comfortable office chair and sighed softly. Michael Lynn remembered the scene when Eric contacted him in private more than 2 years ago. At that time, Eric was not as easy to talk to as he was just now. Michael Lynn would never think that Eric's personality had changed so much in just 2 years. It was mainly because his position in Eric's heart had changed. At that time, he was on Robert Shea's side. At this time, Eric had already regarded him as one of his own. This recognition of his identity was also the reward for his 2 years of conscientious management of Firefly. Of course, Michael Lynn was not unwilling to accept the position of CEO of Firefly Pictures. It was just that he knew when to advance and when to retreat more than Robert Shea. When he realized that Eric was likely to let Jeffrey Katzenberg take over after his contract expired, Michael Lynn also had a period of hesitation. However, he quickly figured out some things. In a film company like Firefly Pictures, which had a simple and direct shareholding structure, if there was internal strife to protect his position, it would only lead to him being kicked out. Although outsiders had always speculated, as a person involved, Michael Lynn knew very well that the 1991 summer, Throat Island, which made Disney Pictures and Robert Shea lose hundreds of millions of dollars, was a trap thrown out by Eric. When Robert Shea was at Firefly, he had a big quarrel with Eric. After leaving, he planned to regroup. However, the film company he ran had not improved in the past 2 years. Several films that he spent a lot of money to shoot also ended in a quiet and dismal way. Many people had even forgotten Robert Shea. Among them, of course, Firefly Pictures had secretly added fuel to the fire, including the newly established DreamWorks Productions, through various cooperation. The major film companies that Firefly Pictures could directly influence in Hollywood included Sony Columbia, 20th Century Fox and MGM. Together with Firefly Pictures itself, the 4 major film companies accounted for most of the power in Hollywood. Under this terrifying influence, Eric did not even need to give any instructions. The other film companies that directly cooperated with Firefly Pictures would not cooperate with Robert Shea's production company. Even the other 3 major film companies would not easily contact Robert Shea in order to maintain a good relationship with Firefly Pictures. Understanding these advantages and disadvantages, Michael Lynn certainly did not want to end up in the same situation as Robert Shea. Therefore, he wisely made the decision just now. By taking the initiative to withdraw, not only could he keep his shares in Firefly Pictures and get a generous bonus every year, but he could also keep the contacts he had accumulated in Firefly Pictures over the years. Not to mention Eric Williams, even his successor, Jeffrey Katzenberg, would remember his benefits. This would be a great help for him to continue to develop his career in Hollywood in the future. Eric was a little confused at first, but after calming down and thinking about it, he quickly understood Michael Lynn's intention in making this decision. However, it was great that Michael Lynn could figure it out. Eric would not treat him badly in the future. There was still some time before work ended. Eric returned to his office. He had just read a few documents when the phone on the desk rang. Eric picked up the phone and the secretary outside said a few words. Eric nodded and said, "Let her in." After a while, the Spanish girl looked into the office and happened to meet Eric's smiling expression. "Hi, little wildcat," Eric called out. Penelope Cruz relaxed when she heard this address. She pushed the door open and came in. The girl was wearing a black spaghetti strap dress and holding a delicate white handbag in her hand. She carefully closed the office door and walked to the opposite side of Eric's desk. She complained a little bitterly. "Eric, I thought you had forgotten about me. How is that possible? I just came back from Tokyo yesterday. I haven't had time to call you yet," Eric said and hooked his finger at the girl. "Come here, let me kiss you." Eric's desk was very large. The computer monitor, landline, and a pile of documents on the desktop only occupied a small part of the space. Penelope gave Eric a wild smile. She pushed the desk with her small hands and jumped up. She pushed the stack of documents in front of her to the side, and slowly climbed over the desk to the front of Eric. Eric smiled in surprise. He didn't mind. He gently kissed the Spanish girl's lips and asked, "What have you been doing recently?" Penelope didn't go down after the kiss. She kicked off her high heels and swung her legs lazily on Eric's desk like a little wild cat. She looked at Eric, who was reading the documents, and said, "After our training ended, Michelle said that there were changes in the plan for the break-in charming baby, so she let us join a short-term acting class. Well, it's never wrong to learn more now. When you become famous in the future, you won't have the time. Eric, when will the movie start shooting?" Eric put down the documents and thought for a while. He said, "Do you know about the DreamWorks production company set up by Firefly Pictures and MGM?" "Yes, I just heard about it today. This project has been transferred to DreamWorks Production Company. The specific cooperation proposal should be out this week. When the Paris side comes up with a confirmed proposal, the Break-in Charming Baby project will enter the actual production stage. The shooting should start at the end of September. This is a project that Firefly and MGM have given the green light. The production funds are very abundant, so there won't be any obstacles." After getting the information she wanted to know the most, Penelope said with satisfaction, "I'll tell those two guys later. They're still worried that the movie will be cancelled." Eric reached out his hand and pinched Penelope's sharp chin. He teased, "Aren't you worried?" "Of course not, this is your movie." Penelope shook her head and flung Eric's hand away. She reached out and pressed it against the table. She reached out and drew on Eric's palm with her finger. "Eric, my sister has already come to Los Angeles. Mom was worried that I wouldn't be able to take good care of Monica at first. I gave her $200,000 and she didn't say anything else. Also, I bought a house in Santa Monica for $950,000 and a Toyota sedan for $50,000. I chose a private Spanish high school for my sister's school fees." Penelope said this as if nothing had happened, but she was carefully observing Eric's expression. Although Eric gave her a credit card that allowed her to overdraw a huge amount, the smart Spanish girl knew very well that this was definitely not something she could squander. Especially when she bought the house, the Spanish girl was very nervous. That was $950,000. Before the age of 18, she had never imagined that she could spend nearly $1 million in one go. This amount of money, if converted to the current Spanish currency, was equivalent to 60 million pesetas. Eric only listened for a moment before he interrupted Penelope to continue reporting the bill to him. In fact, Eric was very clear about these things, so he was quite satisfied with Penelope's recent performance. "Don't talk about these disappointing things. I don't want to hear it." The Spanish girl immediately stopped and changed the topic. "Eric, can you come to my place tonight and see the new house I decorated? I have a dinner date with someone. I can't go back with you." Eric saw Penelope's eyes immediately lit up. He said, "It's not suitable to take you this time. Let's talk about it when we have the chance." Penelope did not show any disappointment. She asked, "Then can you come to my place after dinner?" "It might be very late. It will affect your rest." Penelope shook her head. "It's okay." "Okay then. Tell me the address. I'll go over tonight." Penelope took the pencil and paper from Eric and wrote the address on the table. She also took out a key from her handbag and handed it to Eric. Eric took it and put it away. He thought of the other two girls and asked, "Are Kate and Charlie living with you?" "No, they are still living in the original apartment." "Eric, do you want me to invite them to move in together?" "Oh, there's no need. I think even if you ask, they won't move in." Penelope stuck out her little tongue. Of course, she knew why Eric said that, but she did not care. Penelope stayed in Eric's office for a while before leaving. After work, Eric and Michael drove to a 3-star Michelin restaurant on Amanda Avenue near the headquarters of Firefly. During the meal, they did not talk about any business. They just chatted about everything. Although the biological age difference was big, Eric had 2 lifetimes of experience after all. His knowledge was no less than Michael Lynn's. The two found a lot of common topics. After dinner, they even felt a little unsatisfied. Michael Lynn lived in Burbank for the convenience of his work, so he was very familiar with the area. Soon he brought Eric to a bar with a good environment. They only separated when it was close to 11 o'clock in the evening. Eric got into the car drunkenly and remembered what happened in the afternoon. He took out a note from his pocket and handed it to the driver. He said, "Take me to this place." After some time, Eric heard someone calling him. He opened his eyes and saw the driver in the front seat pointing out the window. "Mr. Williams, we're here." Eric turned his head and saw a small villa by the side of the road. The lights were still on. He said to the driver, "You can go back first. Come and pick me up next morning." After getting out of the car, Eric shook his dizzy head. Under the streetlight, he saw that it was a white 2-story villa. The surrounding trees were dancing in the shadows. The environment was very good. The Spanish girl was quite good at choosing a place. Eric came to the door. Just as he was about to press the doorbell, he remembered that Penelope had left him the key. He looked for it and found the key in his trouser pocket. He opened the door and walked in. Chapter 555. There was only one wall lamp turned on in the living room of the villa, and Spanish sounds came from the television. The side of the sofa was facing the door, and Eric saw a Spanish girl curled up on the sofa, staring intently at the television screen. She was holding a bag of chips in her hand, and she would stuff a chip into her mouth from time to time, making the crunching sound of a mouse chewing on something. "Hi, little wild cat." Eric walked closer to the sofa and greeted her. The Spanish girl turned her head and suddenly saw Eric. Her eyes suddenly widened, and her little nose sniffed. When she smelled the smell of alcohol on Eric, she shrank back and even held the bag of chips in front of her to protect herself. Eric also felt that something was wrong, but he also felt that it might be because he drank too much tonight. He instinctively shook his head, but it caused a wave of dizziness. He couldn't help but sit down on the sofa, reached out to hug the girl beside him, and put her on his lap with a little force. "Sorry, Penny, I accidentally drank too much." Eric pulled out the bag of chips that the girl was still holding in her hand, and threw it on the coffee table. He stuck his head out and kissed the girl on the lips. The girl, who was originally in a daze, felt Eric's action, and her face immediately became abnormally hot. Her eyelashes quickly blinked a few times, and the girl recovered from this series of sudden situations. At this time, she also recognized Eric. She was a little shy as she put her hands in front of Eric to stop him from continuing to move. She said in choppy English, "Williams, sir, I'm no Penny, I'm Monica." "What did you say?" Monica Cruz's accent was a little heavy, and Eric, who was still dizzy, couldn't hear clearly for a moment. Monica was about to explain when a voice rang out. "Monica, I just heard the sound of a car outside. Is that Eric?" "Ah." Penelope came down from the second floor and walked to the staircase, just in time to see her younger sister sitting on Eric's lap with a bashful expression. She immediately let out a soft cry of surprise. Eric turned his head and saw Penelope standing at the top of the stairs in the same black dress as she had in the afternoon. He then looked at the girl in a white nightgown in his arms, and remembered that Penelope had mentioned that her sister had arrived in Los Angeles. The two girls looked too similar. Although he could tell that they were two different people at a closer look, Eric couldn't tell how they looked different. Looking at Penelope, who was surprised at first and then had a strange expression on her face, Eric subconsciously held Monica's waist and carried the girl to the side. He said, "I was wondering why I felt that she was a little light. So it's my little sister." Monica Cruz's eyes were filled with confusion, but Penelope burst out laughing. Ignoring the slightly awkward Eric, she walked to the sofa and whispered something in her sister's ear. Monica nodded shyly, stood up and said goodnight to Eric before running to the second floor. When Monica's figure disappeared, Penelope imitated her sister's behavior just now and sat on Eric's lap, hugging Eric's neck and pretending to be dissatisfied. She said, "Eric, don't tell me you think that I'm a little fat?" Penelope didn't mention the blunder just now, And Eric wouldn't take the initiative to mention it either. He stroked the girl's soft waist and said, "Yes, but I think that women still have more feeling when they're a little chubby." Penelope followed Eric's strength and pressed herself against the man's body. She moved closer to his ear and asked teasingly, "How does it feel?" "I'm a little drunk and can't remember at the moment. I'll have to try to know." "Then let's try." Penelope moved closer and gently bit Eric's ear. She whispered, "Let's do it here." Monica Cruz couldn't sleep well the whole night when she remembered some of the sounds she heard while hiding at the stairs last night. Monica Cruz was originally somewhat in awe and curious about her sister's man. In Spain, she had heard more than once about the series of miracles Eric had created. But the little blunder last night inexplicably transformed the girl's awe and curiosity into something else. She still had to go to school during the day. Although she didn't sleep well at night, Monica still got up on time. Thinking that Eric must still be here, she stood by the wardrobe and hesitated for a while before choosing a pink dress to wear. Although she still had to wear her school uniform when she went to school, she felt that it was good to let him see her, even if it was just for a while. Walking out of the bedroom, the corridor on the second floor was very quiet. Penelope's door was still closed. She thought that her sister and Eric hadn't woken up yet, so she went downstairs in disappointment to prepare breakfast. When she came downstairs, Monica saw Eric's busy figure in the kitchen. There was also a faint smell of oatmeal in the air. Hearing the noise behind him, Eric, who was making fried eggs, turned around. This time he didn't recognize the wrong person. The two sisters did look very similar, but there was a big difference in their temperaments. Penelope had a wild charm, while Monica didn't have such an aura. After saying good morning, Eric knew that Monica didn't know much English. He asked slowly, "Is Penny awake?" Monica felt very comfortable when Eric deliberately spoke to her in a slow tone. She said obediently, "Not yet." After saying this, Monica added, "She often sleeps in." After saying this, Monica noticed the teasing smile that flashed across Eric's face. She immediately lowered her head shyly, secretly regretting saying that. "Then let's not bother about her. Help me scoop out the oatmeal. Let's have breakfast first," Eric said as he pointed to the side. Although Monica didn't understand some of the words, she understood Eric's hand gesture very well. She quickly went forward, took out 2 small bowls from the cupboard, and scooped out the fragrant oatmeal. After dividing the breakfast into 2 portions, the two walked to the dining room next door. After sitting down, Eric looked at the empty right side. In the past, there would always be a stack of newspapers here, even when they were in Europe. "Have you decided on the newspapers?" Monica looked up and was confused for a few seconds before she remembered the meaning of the word newspapers. "Yes, I'll go get them." After a while, Monica walked back to the dining room with a few newspapers and handed them to Eric. Penelope didn't order many newspapers. Most of them were women-oriented newspapers and 2 tabloids. Fortunately, Eric found a copy of the Los Angeles Times among them. This time, he opened it up beside him. Monica ate her breakfast in small bites, pretending to look up at Eric unintentionally from time to time. If their eyes happened to meet, she would smile obediently. Eric flipped a page of the newspaper and asked, "Today is Wednesday. You still have school, right?" "Yes." Hearing Eric speak, Monica immediately focused. She even said the name of a private school that Eric didn't understand at all. It sounded like Spanish. They chatted casually until breakfast, but Penelope didn't get up. Eric remembered that Penelope said that she didn't have anything to do today, so he didn't wake her up. After breakfast, Monica took the initiative to clean up the tableware and returned to her room. A few minutes later, she walked out in her school uniform with a school bag in her hand. Very beautiful. Eric, who was flipping through the Los Angeles Times in the living room, saw Monica in a white sleeveless shirt and a red and black checkered short skirt appear in front of him. Speaking of school uniforms, relatively speaking, Eric preferred the Japanese girls' sailor uniforms. The American high school uniforms were relatively more formal. "Thank you, Eric. I'll be leaving then." Monica waved her hand. After getting a response, she pushed the door open and walked out. Eric looked at his watch. It should be about time. He left a note for Penelope, rolled up the Los Angeles Times that he hadn't finished reading, and walked out of the Spanish girl's villa. He planned to finish reading it in the car on the way to the company. The driver was already waiting by the roadside in front of the villa. The lights were dim last night, so Eric didn't see it. Now he saw the front of the villa. Across the lawn and gentle slope, there was an endless blue sea. He could faintly hear the sound of waves. Moreover, the road in front of the villa was in a C shape. There were no buildings on either side, so privacy was very good. If they wanted to be more hidden, they could build a wall. It seemed that the Spanish girl had put a lot of thought into it. Of course, these thoughts cost money. It was only 1993. In Santa Monica, there weren't many mansions worth close to $1 million. At this time, most of the houses in Santa Monica weren't worth more than $300,000. Eric looked around. Monica's figure had disappeared. The school bus in America was very convenient. Eric didn't care how the girl would get to school. He got into his Bentley business car and ordered the driver to drive. The car drove forward a few dozen meters. After making a turn, Eric looked up and saw Monica standing quietly by the fork. He asked the driver to stop the car. Eric rolled down the window and waved at the girl. "Do you want me to send you to school?" Monica had said that the school bus would be here soon. But seeing Eric's gentle smile, the girl's heart palpitated slightly. She nodded softly. Eric opened the car door and moved in a little so that Monica could sit next to him. After asking for the school's address, the car started again. Monica's school wasn't too far away. In less than 10 minutes, the car stopped in front of a private high school. Although America was a country on wheels, a car like the Bentley was still difficult for many ordinary people to reach. Moreover, Santa Monica wasn't a rich district like Beverly Hills. Most of the students here were only from middle-class families. After the car stopped, many of the students walking towards the school gate looked at Eric's car. Some students even stopped, as if they wanted to see who would come out of the car. After all, she was just a simple-minded 16-year-old girl. Feeling the gazes from outside the car window, Monica's little vanity was greatly satisfied. She looked at Eric with a different meaning in her eyes. "Let's stop here. I won't get out of the car. I'll be recognized." Eric reached out and opened the door on the other side for the girl. Feeling Eric's arm inadvertently touching her, Monica didn't dodge this time. She thanked him shyly. After hesitating for a moment, she suddenly leaned over and kissed Eric's face. Only then did she escape from the car. Eric smiled and touched the cheek that was sneakily kissed just now. He thought to himself, "I haven't even started the quest yet, and the dungeon completion rate is already 90%. Putting aside the little evil thoughts in his heart, Eric picked up the school bag that the girl beside him pulled down and handed it to the driver. "Send this to Miss Cruz." In Paris, the negotiations on the equity division of DreamWorks Pictures came to a final conclusion in the last 3 days. Firefly Pictures took 30% of the shares and became the largest shareholder of the production company. Some European film capitals took the remaining 55%. In the end, MGM Pictures took 15% of the shares through an equity exchange. At the same time, DreamWorks Pictures took nearly 9% of MGM's shares. After the final proposal was released, MGM once again began to publicize it with great fanfare. However, the management of MGM once again played a little trick. They did not disclose the specific equity exchange conditions between the two sides. They only repeatedly announced that MGM held 15% of DreamWorks Studios shares and was the second largest shareholder after Firefly. Influenced by this good news, MGM's share price rose by 11% in just 1 week. Many investors were interested in MGM shares, which had been ignored by Credit Lyonnais. However, Credit Lyonnais was no longer in a hurry to sell them. Even if DreamWorks Studios produced a movie with a box office performance half of that of Jurassic Park, in the next 3 years, the market value of MGM would continue to rise. By then, Credit Lyonnais would choose the right time to make a move. They could even recoup their initial losses of hundreds of millions of dollars, or perhaps even realize some profits. After the contract with DreamWorks Studios was confirmed, Eric also began to lead the preparation for the production of Thunderbolt Girls. To ensure that nothing went wrong, this time he personally participated in the entire production process of the movie. At the same time, Eric also began to frequently meet with several major Hollywood management companies to select suitable scripts for DreamWorks Studios' remaining 8 films besides Thunderbolt Girls and Resident Evil. This was the first time that Eric had publicly selected a script on a large scale. Although it was not for Firefly Pictures itself, the script managers of the 3 major agencies had broken through the threshold of the copyright department of Firefly Pictures in just a few days. A large number of high-quality projects waiting to be developed were sent to Eric one after another, dazzling him. It also made many independent film companies who wanted a good script, but could not get one to look at it with envy. Chapter 556. Since CAA expanded the business scope of agents in the 1980s, more professional script agents appeared. After the channels were opened, in addition to the various types of adapted scripts that were specially hired by film companies, Hollywood film companies would receive thousands of original scripts every year. Once these scripts were selected by major film companies, they could even be sold for millions of dollars. Often, many poor boys who were originally penniless would enter the ranks of millionaires. Therefore, Hollywood had another name for original scripts, which was speculative scripts. The first script that Eric sold, Back to 17, was a very successful speculative script. In recent days, in order to select projects for the DreamWorks film company set up in cooperation with MGM Pictures, Eric would carry a thick tome with him wherever he went. It looked like a famous novel, but the 500-page tome was actually a summary of scripts submitted by many Hollywood agencies. After the news of the selection of scripts was released, Eric's desk was initially filled with scripts that had undergone preliminary screening every day. In his current situation, Eric simply could not spare enough time to read them one by one, so he just gave a few simple instructions. A day later, a carefully bound summary of scripts was delivered to him according to Eric's requirements. Except for some essential information such as the script author, each script was reduced to a short story of about 2 or 3 pages. Rupert Murdoch sat in his luxury car on the main road of Firefly Studios, looking at the huge studios and busy crowds on both sides. He could not help but feel a little emotional. But when he thought of today's meeting, a trace of worry surfaced in his heart. The luxury car passed through the office area and stopped outside a well-decorated restaurant inside Firefly Studios. Because it was not lunchtime yet, there were not many people in the restaurant. When Murdoch walked into the restaurant, he saw Eric in the corner, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, leisurely reading a book, like any ordinary young employee of Firefly Studios. If he had not witnessed the whole process, who would have imagined that a young man who was not even 25 years old, in just a few years, had swallowed Disney from scratch and established the large-scale Firefly Pictures? Although the acquisition of Disney's funding source was a miracle, Murdoch knew that even without the oil crisis caused by the war 2 years ago, it was only a matter of time before Firefly Pictures developed into one of Hollywood's major film companies. Out of the corner of his eye, Eric sensed that someone had entered the restaurant. He looked up and found that it was Rupert. He quickly put down his book and got up to greet him. "Rupert, didn't we make an appointment at 12? Why are you here so early?" Murdoch shook hands with Eric with a smile and said, "I was curious about what you looked like when you were working, so I came to take a look in advance. I didn't expect them to tell me that you were here." Eric sat down with Murdoch and explained, "I just talked to a director here. He left not long ago." Murdoch asked curiously, "Is it 007 or Thunderbolt? I heard that MGM also gave 007 to you. 007 won't be produced until at least next year, and I won't interfere too much. At present, Thunderbolt is the main project. But coincidentally, I chose the same director for both films, the one I just met. His name is Martin Campbell." Murdoch did not think of Martin Campbell for a while, but there must be something special about the person who could make Eric give him 2 heavyweight films at the same time. Murdoch secretly remembered the name and planned to ask someone to investigate it. Maybe he could win over Fox. The waiter quickly brought a cup of coffee for Murdoch. Murdoch took a sip, But he was not willing to talk about the topic of today's meeting. Seeing the large book in front of Eric with a delicate binding but no title, he continued to chat and asked, "What are you reading?" "For the DreamWorks matter, I recently received a lot of scripts. I asked someone to make a simple summary of the scripts. It's very interesting to read," Eric said, pushing the book in front of Murdoch. Like other film companies in Hollywood, Murdoch was very envious of Eric's plan to provide 10 films to MGM with DreamWorks as the production company in 3 years. If possible, Fox did not even mind cooperating on the same terms. After all, an average of 3 high-quality films a year would not make a big film company dependent on the production company, and it could also bring very rich profits. No one would not covet it. But he was also very clear about a series of complicated transactions behind the establishment of DreamWorks, so he could only watch this fat piece of meat fall into the hands of MGM, a broken Hollywood company, like other film executives. Murdoch simply flipped through the book and handed it to Eric, saying, "These are all speculative scripts. Can you pick out a good one?" The scripts that could be sent to Eric must be good. Of course, Eric was more of a pick-up. If he could find a good script in his memory, it would be better. If not, he would just treat it as reading a short story collection. And if he found a script that he was very interested in, and did not have a high budget, Eric would pick it out for the production department to try. Of course, Eric would not put all his attention on the original scripts in his hands. He also asked people to investigate some good films that would appear in the next few years according to his memory of his previous life. If it was not enough in the end, Eric also planned to pick a few blockbusters that did not appear in the original spacetime to make. As for the results, he did not care. Anyway, DreamWorks did not involve Firefly's interests too much. As long as he could ensure that more than half of the 10 films made money, he would be very worthy of the European investors. Putting aside the book that Murdoch handed over, Eric replied, "I have a good eye." Murdoch was really envious of Eric's eye. If he could have Eric's eye, News Corporation would have already ruled the world. Of course, he could only be envious of this. Picking up the coffee and taking another sip, Murdoch said, "I thought you would write the script yourself." "If I encounter something I'm interested in, of course I'll write 1 or 2, just like Thunderbolt. But my personal energy is still limited." Eric saw that Murdoch did not seem to want to talk about the topic, so he was not in a hurry. Anyway, the withdrawal plan for Firefly Pictures' withdrawal from Fox Television Network had been submitted to Fox a few days ago. Even if Murdoch was unwilling to talk about it this time, or even if the talks between the two fell through, Firefly Pictures could still withdraw from Fox Television Network completely according to the normal business process. Of course, in this case it would definitely drag on a little longer. Unknowingly, it was 12 o'clock in lunchtime. There was a large staff cafeteria in the studio, but there were still many staff members walking into the restaurant from time to time. Although they saw the 2 big Hollywood bosses sitting here, these staff members consciously did not come to the table around Eric and Murdoch, but this was no longer the time to talk about business. After ordering 2 lunches, Eric and Murdoch continued to chat. After lunch, seeing that the people in the restaurant were almost gone, Eric asked the waiter to remove the tableware and put on the coffee. Both of them were busy people. At this time, Murdoch did not mention some unimportant topics. Eric took the initiative to say, "Rupert, you should have read the withdrawal plan, right?" Murdoch nodded and took a sip of the coffee. The bitter taste made him frown. He added a few pieces of sugar to the coffee and said, "Eric, although Firefly Pictures has developed very well in the past 2 years, don't you think that you are too hasty? Since I have seen the future, of course, I have to go there early. It's better than going forward with a group of people in the future." Since this year, Viacom and QVC had bid for Paramount, and the merger of media groups had begun. There were a total of 3 large television networks in the United States. If the pace was slow, they would definitely have to compete with other groups in the future. Then, both the difficulty of acquisition and the price to pay would greatly increase. With your character, even if you choose a certain proportion of share swaps and acquisitions, you will certainly not give up too many shares. You don't plan to list Firefly Pictures, so the only way is to issue bonds. Murdoch casually told Eric's plan and said, "You should know the risks." Many companies that originally developed very well were dragged down by the huge accumulation of debt in the process of unrestrained mergers and acquisitions. Just like the current MGM, because of a large amount of debt accumulation, even if it generates some profits every year, it is often barely enough to pay the debt interest. This film company has not much value now except for the profits that shareholders repeatedly resell. If you expand blindly, Firefly Pictures is likely to fall into the same situation. At this point, Murdoch took a sip of the sweet coffee and continued to look like a kind elder. He said to Eric earnestly, "Eric, a simple calculation shows that even if Firefly Pictures issues $5 billion of long-term bonds, with an annual interest rate of 5%, the annual debt interest payment is as high as $250 million. Not to mention that there is still a debt principal of $5 billion. These funds have to be repaid. The uncertainty of film investment is great, and it is impossible to maintain a high profit. Moreover, television networks are not so easy to run. Once Firefly Pictures falls into a loss, you will find that the originally enthusiastic Wall Street capital forces will immediately open their claws and try to control your company as creditors. I have personally encountered this more than once." Eric, of course, had considered these problems repeatedly and had a lot of countermeasures in mind. At this time, of course, Eric also knew that Murdoch was not really thinking for him. This old fox just did not want to lose the original cooperation with Firefly Pictures. In addition to a few television programs, the high-quality films produced by Firefly in the past 2 years were basically broadcast on the Fox television network. A large number of high-quality films with high box office not only brought more than the ratings for Fox television network, but also greatly improved the brand reputation of Fox television network. In this regard, 20th Century Fox's performance was much worse. Once Firefly Pictures bought his own television network, the original cooperation between the two sides would definitely be cancelled, and they would even become enemies. Losing the film supply of Firefly Pictures was secondary, but at this time several of Fox's main programs, Friends, The X-Files, and Who Will Be a Millionaire, were inextricably linked to Firefly Pictures. Although Murdoch had created a series of miracles in the newspaper business, he was not very good at media content. For example, in the past few years, although there were several television programs such as Friends supporting the ratings, Fox itself had not developed a popular television program with complete copyright. The importance of these mainstay programs to a television network, without mentioning anything else, could be seen from the sky-high salaries of the 6 lead actors in the last few seasons of Friends in the original Spacetime. Although Eric was young, Murdoch did not treat Eric as an inexperienced young man. He believed that if necessary, even if Eric could not take back all 3 programs, he would destroy them all, because Murdoch knew that he would do so when necessary. And Firefly Pictures, which held at least half of the copyrights, definitely had the authority to do so. After talking until his mouth was dry again, Murdoch picked up the coffee again and looked at the indifferent expression of the young man opposite him. He could not help but sigh. Putting down the coffee cup, Murdoch finally had to ask, "Eric, since you have made up your mind, let's talk about Friends." The acquisition of a television network is not something that can be done overnight, but after this year, the contract between Fox and Firefly will expire. How about we talk about the renewal of the contract? The copyright of Friends completely belonged to Firefly, and the other 2 programs had a 5-season contract that would not expire until next year. Moreover, by talking about Friends first, Murdoch was also testing Eric's attitude. Eric did not beat around the bush and said bluntly, "Rupert, the contract of Friends will definitely not be renewed, but for the other 2 programs, I can assure you that after the contract expires next year, Firefly Pictures can still renew the contract with Fox." Chapter 557. Eric's guarantee meant nothing to Murdoch. Even if the contract was renewed, half of the copyrights to The X-Files and Who Will Be a Millionaire were still in the hands of Firefly Pictures. Once Firefly Pictures completed the acquisition of its own television network, and The X-Files and Who Will Be a Millionaire unfortunately became competitors of some of Firefly's TV stations, who could guarantee that Firefly would not secretly do something. Murdoch still remembered the fiasco of Throat Island 2 years ago, and he also learned some of the inside story from his daughter. A movie not only brought a loss of more than $100 million, but it also completely destroyed the confidence of Disney Pictures shareholders in the management at that time. Otherwise, it would not have been so easy for Firefly to acquire Disney at that time. With worry in his heart, Murdoch said, "Eric, how about this? How about selling the other half of the copyrights to The X-Files and Who Will Be a Millionaire to Fox?" Eric had long expected that Murdoch would make such a request. The loss of Friends was already a great blow to Fox. Once Firefly Pictures withdrew its shares from Fox, the two sides would no longer have a direct interest dispute. If Firefly still held the copyrights to the remaining 2 shows, it would be tantamount to completely exposing their weaknesses to their opponents. Although The X-Files and Friends were both phenomenal TV series in the 1990s, the audiences of the 2 TV series were very different. Most of the audience of The X-Files was concentrated among young people in their 20s. Although there were many die-hard fans, the size of the audience was naturally limited. Friends was an all-ages sitcom, and it was basically not limited by the age of the audience. Therefore, the influence of Friends was much greater than that of The X-Files. Now that he was ready to take back the broadcasting rights of Friends, Eric was prepared to give up The X-Files. Moreover, the copyrights of The X-Files could also be used as a very important bargaining chip. As for Who Will Become a Millionaire, the format of the show was very simple. After a few years of broadcasting, the audience inevitably developed aesthetic fatigue, and the ratings of the show in North America gradually declined. However, because of the success of the reality show in the United States, many overseas television stations negotiated the licensing of the show every year. The income from this was very stable, and there was no cost at all. Moreover, if he were to sell half of the rights to Fox, the price that the other party would offer would definitely be much lower than the future profits of the program. Although Eric was in urgent need of money to acquire the network, he was not that short of money, so of course, he would not give up so easily. "Rupert, as long as the price is right, I can transfer the copyright of The X-Files to Fox, but I won't let go of the copyright of Who Will Be a Millionaire? You must know why. Of course, if you are worried that Firefly will interfere too much in the production of Who Will Become a Millionaire in the future, Firefly can give up participating in the production process and only invest and enjoy the corresponding share. Moreover, Firefly can also extend the original 5-year contract in advance." What Murdoch cared about the most was Friends. But at this time, when he heard Eric say these conditions without hesitation, Murdoch was still a little surprised that Eric would let go so easily. Eric noticed Murdoch's surprised expression and said, "Of course there's a condition to all of this." Murdoch felt that things were a little more normal and said, "Go ahead. I want Fox to complete all the procedures to buy back the shares of Firefly within a month. Of course, in order to avoid cash flow problems for News Corporation, the repurchase funds can be paid in installments over the next 6 months. Eric ignored Murdoch's gradually dignified expression and continued, "If we can't reach an agreement within a month, then the conditions I just said are invalid." Only then did Murdoch realize that Eric was more anxious than he originally thought. Although Firefly Pictures only held 10% of Fox's shares, this 10% was already the second largest shareholder of Fox, second only to the Murdoch family. In theory, Firefly Pictures had the right to speak in Fox, second only to the Murdoch family. It was just that Eric had never used this right in the past few years. And rights and obligations were often relative. According to the federal antitrust law of the United States, Firefly Pictures had such an important right to speak in the 4th largest television network in the United States, so they could not easily launch acquisitions of other national television networks. Otherwise, the acquisition was very likely to be jointly investigated by the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Communications Commission. If there were other forces behind the scenes intervening, there would be even more trouble. Therefore, Eric was anxious to sell the shares of Fox within a month, so that Firefly Pictures would not face similar legal risks when they launched acquisitions of other television networks. Of course, this kind of issue involving monopoly was not what Murdoch was most concerned about. There was a lot of room for maneuver in the antitrust laws of the United States, which involved more of a game of interests between different forces. Moreover, monopoly restrictions in the media industry had been gradually relaxed in recent years. What Murdoch was more concerned about was limiting the negotiation period to 1 month. At this time, it seemed that Fox was not in an advantageous position. Then, regarding the issue of Firefly Pictures' offer, News Corporation would definitely not have any advantage. A few years ago, Eric personally took 10% of the shares from him for only $80 million. Firefly Pictures' offer for withdrawal of shares at this time was $800 million. Although this offer was not much different from the current market value of Fox, a difference of 10 times was still very difficult for Murdoch to accept. Eric, if you want to withdraw from Fox within a month, $800 million is definitely not enough. Murdoch thought for a moment and said, I can only give you $600 million at most, and the payment period of this money needs to be extended by at least 1 year. Eric smiled and said, Rupert, you know my character is actually not suitable for negotiations. Murdoch looked puzzled. Eric did not give up and continued, Why don't I ask Katzenberg to negotiate with Fox on behalf of Firefly Pictures? Katzenberg's style had always been known for being tough. Eric remembered that in the original Space-Time, Katzenberg was responsible for the negotiations between Disney and Pixar Studios. The final agreement was that the animation produced by Pixar Studios not only could not participate in the profit sharing of Disney's peripheral copyright operations, but also did not even have a share of the box office profits. Pixar could only get a fixed commission for each 3D animated film. In the end, Toy Story was a great success, but Pixar Studios did not receive much funding. In desperation, Jobs could only choose to go public when Pixar's performance had just improved. Of course, Murdoch was also very clear about what kind of person Katzenberg was. The nickname of the manic golden retriever was not for nothing. With a wry smile, Murdoch said, Eric, you only spent $80 million when you got the shares 10 years ago. Do you think the price of $800 million is reasonable? Eric said matter-of-factly, If it weren't for the programs provided by Firefly Pictures that allowed Fox to quickly expand, perhaps the original 10% of shares would still only be worth $80 million. So if it weren't for the market value of Fox, I actually think this price is very low. I think this price is very reasonable. Speaking of this, Eric could not help but shake his head. Rupert, actually, I think there's something wrong with the production team of the Fox network. After 4 whole years, they haven't even produced a TV show comparable to The X-Files in terms of influence. Maybe you should change the person in charge or something. Murdoch smiled bitterly in his heart. This kind of thing was not so easy. The U.S. television industry produced tens of thousands of original TV series every year, but the proportion of series that could survive and have enough influence was terrifyingly low. Moreover, this was not just a problem for Fox. The other 3 major TV networks had similar problems. If a show with an average viewership of 20 million people was so good, no TV station would offer a sky-high price of $1 million per episode in order to retain the lead actor of the show. Eric, even if I agree to the price of $800 million, I don't think the board of directors will approve it easily. So, I think you should give in a little. Otherwise, it will be difficult to settle this matter in a month. I still have the same idea. Eric was unmoved. Everyone knew that although the Murdoch family did not have absolute control of News Corporation, no one dared to challenge Murdoch's authority for so many years. Murdoch definitely had control of News Corporation. Looking at the old fox's shrewd eyes, Eric suddenly said, Rupert, you have to know that in fact, if this matter is discussed for a long time, it may leave some impression on Firefly Pictures, but it will definitely not have as much impact as you. Firefly Pictures is not a listed company, but News Corporation is different. Murdoch was shocked. He did not expect Eric to suddenly mention this. He thought that Eric would not have thought of this at all. Eric was right. If it were not for the high-rated series provided by Firefly Pictures that allowed Fox to develop quickly, Fox would not have been able to develop so quickly in the past few years. However, at the same time, the capital market also understood the importance of Firefly Pictures as the second-largest shareholder of Fox, a subsidiary of News Corporation. Therefore, if the withdrawal of shares was delayed for too long and exposed by the media, or even exaggerated the differences between the two sides, then the newly developed Fox network would definitely suffer a heavy setback, and News Corporation's stock price would also be greatly affected. Seeing that Murdoch did not speak, Eric continued, "So we have to settle this matter as soon as possible. Then Firefly Pictures' withdrawal of shares from Fox can be completed as quietly as possible, so that it will not have any impact on News Corporation. Of course, even if someone discovers this later, with the conditions I just mentioned, I believe that News Corporation's shareholders will not lose confidence in Fox. Moreover, Firefly Pictures can also cooperate with some public relations activities in the future." Murdoch fell into a short silence. Eric raised his hand and looked at his watch. It was already 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He took the initiative to stand up and said, "Rupert, this matter is not too urgent. You can go back and think about it. I think I have to go back to work. There are still some things to do in the afternoon." When Murdoch saw that Eric did not continue to be aggressive, although his expression was not too relaxed, he also stood up with Eric. "Then I'll go back first. I'll give you an answer as soon as possible. I look forward to your good news." Eric politely walked Murdoch to his luxury car and watched the other party's car leave. Then he walked back to his office in the administrative building with the large book in his hand. As soon as he sat down behind his desk, Eric's temporary secretary in the studio pushed the door open and put a document in front of Eric. "Mr. Williams, Mr. Fissman just sent this over. He has already talked to Mr. Mel Gibson. In addition, there is a script in it." Eric nodded and waited for the secretary to leave before opening the folder. Inside the folder was a film project proposal, with 2 eye-catching words on the title, Braveheart. This was one of the more successful epic films in Hollywood in the 1990s. Although the box office was not ideal, it still made a profit. Most importantly, this film won a series of important Oscars, such as Best Film, Best Director, Best Actor, and so on. Of course, these were not what Eric was most concerned about. The reason why he thought of this film was that Eric had met Sophie in France. If he wanted to bring this French rose to Hollywood as soon as possible, there was nothing more suitable than this film. Mel Gibson's status in Hollywood in the 1990s was definitely not inferior to that of Harrison Ford and Kevin Costner. If it were not for Mel Gibson's series of suicidal actions in the new century, with his series of box office and achievements in awards, Mel Gibson would definitely become one of the legendary figures in Hollywood history. Eric did not care too much about Mel Gibson's affairs. After all, many Hollywood stars had those problems. It was just that Mel Gibson's scandal was infinitely exaggerated. Chapter 558. Eric spent some time going through all the information. Although the script for Braveheart was very different from what he remembered, Eric didn't care too much about it. In the production process of a movie, besides the script, the director, cinematographer, soundtrack, and final editing all had a great impact on the final result of the movie. When all these factors were combined, an excellent script could end up being a bad film, and an average script could end up being an excellent film. Closing the file, Eric thought of Sophie, who was far away in Paris. He couldn't help but pick up the phone on the desk and dial a long string of international numbers. The receiver beeped a few times before a languid female voice came through. Although Eric couldn't understand Sophie's French, he knew what she meant. "Sophie, it's me," he said. Although the speed of the signal was comparable to the speed of light, there was a large gap between the two conversations due to the long distance and multiple transmissions. It was already midnight in Paris, and a dim wall lamp was on in Sophie's bedroom. Because she was woken up by the phone, the girl's eyes were not fully open, and her long eyelashes kept trembling. Although the gap between the call was only 1 or 2 seconds, Sophie felt that no one spoke for a long time. Just as she was about to hang up the phone, Eric's voice came through. Although the voice was a little distorted, Sophie was still sensitive enough to recognize Eric's voice at the first moment. It was a chilly midnight in Paris. After hearing that voice, Sophie inexplicably felt a hidden bitterness that only girls in love would have when they were in love. She pulled the thin blanket over her shoulders and said, "Eric, it's the wee hours of the morning. You're so inconsiderate." Eric looked at the warm afternoon sun outside the window and felt Sophie's emotions on the other end of the phone. He smiled and said softly, "Maybe it's because I miss you too much. Is this reason enough to get your forgiveness?" Sophie, who was curled up in the blanket, chuckled and said, "I don't believe you, you're such a sweet talker." "Well, I don't think it's a good time to talk about this." Eric quickly changed the topic. "I recently saw a very good script, and I think the female lead is very suitable for you. But since the time isn't right, I'll get someone to send the information to your agent. You can take a look at it tomorrow." Sensing that Eric had the intention to hang up the phone, Sophie felt a little reluctant and said, "Hey, tell me what movie it is first. If I'm not interested, I won't act in it even if you personally send the script to me." "This is an epic film about William Wallace. Do you know William Wallace?" Sophie could vaguely think of some bits and pieces of information, but at this time, the girl who was still squinting her eyes like a cat under the blanket said very confidently, "I don't know. Tell me." Eric didn't know much at first, but fortunately, he had just read a thick stack of information, so he briefly described the information about William Wallace. Sophie held the microphone to her ear and sank into the big bed softly. Her mind was not on the so-called William Wallace that Eric introduced. She very simply felt that Eric's voice sounded very reassuring on the other side of the ocean, and she hummed a few words from time to time. Eric on the other side of the phone had finished talking at some point, but Sophie didn't remember anything. Eric could also feel Sophie's emotions at this time. After hearing that there was no response from the other side after he finished talking about William Wallace, Eric said with a smile, "Baby, how about I tell you the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs?" "Okay." The other side of the phone replied as if she was talking in her sleep, and then Sophie's coquettish voice came again. "Do you think I'm a child? Also, don't call me baby." "Who's your baby?" "Then let's talk about the movie. I'll tell you a simple plot, and then you can decide if you want to take the movie or not." After a while, Sophie's voice came from the other side of the phone. It was very low. "Okay." Eric took out the script of Braveheart from the table and slowly started talking from the beginning. After some time, Eric called out softly a few times, but there was no response. Eric made sure that the girl on the other side of the ocean was asleep before he hung up the phone. The result of this incident was that Eric happened to be staying at the Pointy Corner Manor that night. At midnight, he was naturally awakened by Sophie's phone call. Sophie very confidently said that she wanted to take revenge on Eric for waking her up last night. Eric didn't care, but the little girl in his arms at the time rolled her eyes for an entire hour during the call. The screenwriter of Braveheart, Randall Wallace, had written the script more than a year ago. After a long time in Hollywood, it fell into the hands of Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson was very interested in the script, and he was planning to develop into a director. Therefore, the first thing he did was to find Warner Pictures, which he had the best cooperation with. However, since the popularity of epic movies in the 50s and 60s, there hadn't been a successful case of this kind of movie for many years. Plus, Braveheart involved many war scenes, and the high cost of production, and Mel Gibson had never been a director before. With all these risks added up, Warner rejected the script at the first opportunity. Then Mel Gibson began to take the project to several major film companies, but it was said that when Mel Gibson, who had never directed a movie before, asked to be the director himself, he was basically rejected at the first opportunity. Firefly Pictures received the project proposal for Braveheart in the first half of the year. However, like the other six, Firefly's copyright department evaluated the project's value very low, so it was not sent to Eric at all. When Alan personally approached Mel Gibson on behalf of Eric, Mel Gibson was very surprised, but he gladly took the time to take the initiative to talk with Alan for an entire morning. At that time, Mel Gibson was in Seattle on a promotional tour for his first movie, faceless man. As one of the superstars in Hollywood in recent years, Mel Gibson was surrounded by a lot of paparazzi at all times. Therefore, the next day, photos of Mel Gibson and Eric Williams' personal assistant discussing the new movie plan in secret appeared in many entertainment newspapers. Early the next morning, when Eric saw the news in the newspapers, he couldn't help but have the urge to facebomb. He was too careless. If the production department of Firefly Pictures had been in contact with Mel Gibson, they wouldn't have encountered any obstacles in getting the film that no one was optimistic about. However, the moment the photo appeared in the newspapers, everyone knew that Mel Gibson had personally taken a fancy to the project. Then, almost without thinking, they knew what would happen next. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.